Om. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Dhyaya Nityam Mahesham Rajtagirinibham Charu Chandravatanksam Ratna Kalpojvalangam Parashumar Bhiti Hastam Prasannam Padmasinam Samantat Stutamam Raganai Ragakritim Vasanam Vishwadyam Vishwabijam Nikhila Bhayaharang Panchavaktram Trinetram Nikhila Bhayaharang Panchavaktram Trinetram. Oh, I meditate, dhyayet, eternally, nityam, on that great Lord Mahesha, who resembles a mountain of silver, Rajatagiri, who is shining with glory and resplendent in the lotus of the heart. He is adorned by the crescent moon of the 28th day, the waning moon of the day Shiva Ratri. I meditate upon that Lord whose limbs flash as if adorned with many ornaments. Ujvala Angam. I meditate upon that Lord who is Padmasinam Samantat, who is established in deep meditation, sitting in the lotus posture, who is pleased and smiling and ecstatic, lost in samadhi. He holds in one hand an axe, in the other hand he holds a mriga, a deer. With the other two hands he offers boons and assures fearlessness with the vara and abhaya mudras. All around him there are gods, demons, there are ghosts and rishis and all other such beings gathered around, palms folded, hymning him. I praise that Shiva who has 5 faces and who has 3 eyes. Om Kintu Durgatakaritvat Swachandyan Nirmala Daso Swatma Prachadana Krida Pandita Parameshwaraha. O Lord Shiva, O Parameshwara, you who are the Supreme Lord, you are ever skilled at hiding yourself from yourself without ever once losing your innate pristine quality of freedom and purity. Such is your play, O Lord, and at this game of hide and seek you are expert. Om Param parastham gahanadanadim ekam nivishtam bahuda guhasu sarvalayam sarvacharacharastam tvameva shambhu sharanam prapadye tvameva shambhu sharanam prapadye tvameva sarva mama deva deva tvameva sarva Shiva Mahadeva. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. O Lord Shambhu, I take refuge in you alone. You who are the Guru, you who are the Goddess, you who are the supreme reality, transcendent to the wheel and abyss of transmigratory existence. You are eternal and without limit. You are prior to all experience, manifesting yourself in the hearts of all the variously manifested beings. You are that non-dual absolute, the ground of all reality, which inheres in all things, as all things. I take refuge in you alone, O Shambhu. I take refuge at the feet of my Guru. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharma swarupine avatāra varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. May this be an offering to Sri Ramakrishna. Jai Ma. So I want to talk about some things that we haven't before spoken about, which I think we should speak about. You know, there are a few schools of Shaiva philosophy that are somewhat underrepresented in our lectures. So we come together and we tend to talk about the Advaita stuff. Tantric non-duality, the idea that there's only one reality, Shiva, and inseparable from Shiva is Shakti, and Shakti is Lord Shiva's manifesting power, by which this one non-dual reality shines non-differently in the mirror of consciousness. So this one non-dual reality is called consciousness, endowed with power, which reposes in its own innate bliss, endowed with the power of willing, knowing, and doing. This is Shiva, and Tattvamasi Shvetaketu, that thou art. Your very essence nature and the essence of all things, which inheres in all things as all things, is one and the same, Abhed. So this is called Abhedha Vada, the doctrine of non-difference or non-duality. non-dualism. And it's my favorite brand of Shaivism, of course. I love Advaita Vedanta, otherwise known as Kevala Advaita of Sri Shankara, but I love Advaita Shaiva Vada a little bit more because of its emphasis on the aesthetic glory of the universe and on its emphasis on the universe as a playground for Lord Shiva. Rather than a framework of illusions, it is a mansion of mirth. So we learn Advaita Shaiva, non-dual Shaiva philosophy, that God itself, assumes the form of a Caroline, or a Natalie, or a Francis Chi. Shiva eva grihitva Pāśupata. Lord Shiva alone becomes the ensouled individual, the embodied soul, if you will. And then that person, which is nothing but Shiva, goes on to enjoy myriad experiences, which culminate in the recognition, pratyabhigya, that I am Shiva. So the game is, there's Lord Shiva, and then he wants to play for reasons unknown to us. It's just, after all, play has no reason. If there's a reason to play, it's no longer play, it's work. Anything that you do with some outcome, with some desire for reward or some fear of consequence, is no longer play. Play is something you do for its own sake. Art for art's sake, as Oscar Wilde would say. So there can be no reason for Lord Shiva plays. He plays because he is playful. Similarly, fire is hot. There's no reason for why fire is hot. You can't say fire is the cause and heat is the effect. It's not quite like that. The cause and the effect are one. Here, the effect, the karya, the outcome, is actually inherent in the karana, the cause. So you can't speak in terms of cause and effect. You can't ask why, because to ask why is to ask for a cause. So you can't ask why Shiva plays. It's his nature to play. But his play, his krida, his lila, is such that he svatmavaranam, he hides himself from himself. That's what he likes to do, for whatever reason. So then he appears as a Patrick G or somebody like that, or like a microorganism, or like an animal, or a plant, or a Gandharva, a celestial being, a nymph, or a fairy, or something like, or a person. He appears as these individuals, and forgets that he's Shiva. He doesn't really forget. Remember, Nirmala Daso, he never forgets his inherent purity and freedom, but he acts as if he forgets. And notice, you never forget either. As you go through this world and you accumulate experiences, there's always something in you reminding you that there is more freedom to be had. No matter how much freedom you get from the material world, it's never enough, because you are always at every moment of your life aware of your truly divine nature, and you're aware that nothing can really fulfill it. Because you crave the infinite, and so the finite can never truly satisfy you. So Lord Shiva never loses touch with his own innate freedom. He's always rooted in his freedom. But it just so happens that he acts as if he's not free. He acts bound. At this point, Shiva, the Lord, the Pati is another word for Lord, this supremely free divine being becomes Pashu. Pashu means bound animal. And we are Pashus, because Shiva enacts what is called Pasha. Pasha means bondage, and so I don't like the word bondage. Literally the word Pasha translates to bondage, but I think it has more of the connotation of like art. Kala, which is another word that we use. Kala, which means voluntary self-contraction or sankocha. So this infinite divine reality, Brahman if you will, endowed with this playful nature, spontaneously and effortlessly contracts himself into an individual, a jiva, or in this tradition it's called Pashu. And then the Pashu craves to recognize his true nature, or its true nature as Shiva. And so all of life is an attempt to remember, recognize, pratyabhigya. And then when you recognize, party time, then you can either merge into your oceanic nature as Shiva and abide forevermore as Shiva, or, and this is interesting, or you can continue playing. Something like a bodhisattva, but I think the word might be siddha or something like that, where you know that you're Shiva, and yet you maintain some semblance of finitude in order to enjoy yourself in each and every experience. The whole universe now becomes a revelation. See, each and every encounter with the universe becomes an encounter with yourself, appearing to you in an ever new way, which allows you to enjoy aesthetic rapture. This is called svatma chamatkara, the bliss of encountering yourself in new ways again and again and again. Established in freedom, you have nothing to gain, nothing to lose, and so you just play. So his play becomes your play. So it's almost as if he manifests his world, and phase one of the play is to forget that he's Shiva. That's like act one in a 3-part play, if you will. It's not a tragedy. Usually people think it's like a tragedy. This play is a tragic play. It's not, because it's comedy. It's not a tragedy. It's tragic comedy, right? There's like a genre of literature, of movie, tragic comedy, where the words are just one. Tragic comedy. It's like that. So the tragedy is that he pretends not to be Shiva. It's not a tragedy to him. It's art. Then he plays another game, which is a very interesting game, which is the kind of game that we're all over here playing now. The game of knowing that I'm Shiva, but not truly living as Shiva, so now I become what is called a mumukshu, a seeker after liberation. This too is a game. Remember, you're Shiva through and through. You were Shiva before you forgot, you were Shiva when you were forgetting, and you are Shiva even while you're trying to remember. And when you remember, you realize that you were Shiva all along. But until you fully remember, until there is pratyabhikya, awareness of your inherent Shiva nature, there is a period of your life where, and maybe a period stretching across many lives, where you are a mumukshu, a seeker after liberation, questing, right? Questing for some attainment, some fulfillment, some freedom. And it's a wonderful quest. It's a delightful quest, a challenging quest. It's like dancing on the edge of a sword or wrestling with tigers, which is a play on the Katha Upanishad claim. It's like walking on a razor's edge. We go further. We say, no, it's like dancing on the edge of a sword. Walking always implies you're trying to get somewhere. But in India, there are these sword dancers. Their art is to dance on the edge of swords. It's a dying art. I've never myself seen it, but I've spoken to some people from Indian villages, rural India, who have, and who know families who for generations have been doing this kind of craft, sword dancing. And it's remarkable. If they lose focus, they'll slip and they'll cut their feet. It's a very dangerous thing to do, right? They know how to step. They have an art. How to jump and dance like that. And they'll whirl and jump, and 2 or 3 people. And the sword is very long. It's like 2 people, the way it was described to me by my sadhu friend who saw these things. The one end will be held by a person over here. The other end will be held by a person over there. And then they will dance. And it's seemingly impossible, actually. Spiritual life is a bit like that. You're attempting to dance on the edge of a sword. It requires great tact. See, too much austerity and the body is weakened, but too little also and the body is weakened. Like that. Meditation, too much rigidity and the meditation becomes unstable. But too much softness and easefulness, meditation becomes sleep. Yoga, nidra. I'm kidding. I'm being facetious because now people pay a lot of money to go to this yoga nidra, but it looks like daycare. They just set up a few pillows on the floor, they light a candle, someone knocks a crystal bowl, now everything is sound bath, sound bath, sound bath. It's like the new way to get $35 from a person for giving them like just like a moment to just chill. Because people need that so badly. They don't give themselves a opportunity to chill. They can never crack open a cold one with the boys. So they have to pay $35 to go to this special place, and then someone who just started doing this last week, by the way, will then hit the bowl, and then you can relax. It's a wonderful service, of course. It's needed. It's a very needed service. But that's what amounts to yoga nidra anyway, for the most part. Just okay, $35. Thank you for napping in my yoga space. I hope you enjoyed my little crystal bowl sound bath. Please go home and take an actual bath now, though. The floor is full of sweat from the hot yoga class that just happened an hour ago. Anyway, I'm kidding. But if our meditation doesn't have rigidity, or I should say firmness, then we fall asleep. But too much firmness, you see, it's a delicate art, like dancing on the edge of a sword, or like wrestling tigers. Here, the tarot card, the eighth tarot card in the Major Arcana series. See, Caroline, are you appreciating our throwback to 2020 tarot workshop? But that card, you'll see that she's so gently and sweetly closing the lion's mouth. But if you do it in the wrong way, like grabbing a serpent, Nagarjuna gives this example. Durga sarpa grihitva, something like grabbing a serpent in the wrong way, like that, you'll get bitten. There's a right way to catch the serpent, and it's an art. So spirituality is an art, and it's a very delicate art at that. So this is another game that Lord Shiva plays, the game of being a mukshu. And then he realizes, I was free all along. I was actually Shiva, and this is called pratyabhigya. This is called moksha in one sense, but even that word might be technically inappropriate for this particular state, because you don't necessarily have to lose your individuality. You can maintain your status as not a bound soul, a free soul, but an embodied soul. I'll put it that way. And you can remain in an embodied way and taste the perennial bliss of God forevermore. The coveted state of all bhaktas, to taste sugar, even though you recognize your inherent nature is sugar itself. Like that. So this is Advaita, non-dual Shaivism, where at every step of the way your oneness with the Absolute is affirmed. At no point do you become other than Shiva. In fact, in Advaita, at no point is there anything other than Shiva. Every single thing is Shiva. The entire universe, the whole spectrum of creation is Shiva every step of the way. That's called Advaita Shaiva, and I love it. It's a grand and beautiful philosophy, and I tend to spend most of my time talking about it. So that's what we tend to do when we get together for our satsangs. We talk about either Advaita Vedanta or more likely Tantric non-duality, Advaita Shaiva Vada, which, by the way, in a somewhat sectarian way, Abhinava Gupta calls Param Advaya, supreme non-duality. Everything else is non-duality light. Because the other forms of non-duality require that you dissolve the world of plurality. You can't say everything is one when your manifest experience of the world is of the many. So how do you account for the fact that there are about 60 people in this room? There are 60 bodies, 60 minds. How can you say it's all one? That's flippant. You sound a bit like the mansplainer at the festival who had quite a few microdoses until it's no longer a microdose, and he's like, it's all one, man. It's like, it's a hollow statement. It seems like a very shallow statement. It rings of truth, but it isn't manifestly true. It's a nice thought, but it doesn't actually work when you take it out into the world. As Swami Sarvapriyanandaji likes to joke, when you test drive your Ferrari, you tend to get into an accident. As one sadhu said to me, Swami Supriyanandaji, we were sitting and having a conversation off to the side about Advaita, and they were starting to serve lunch at the ashrama. And then the moment the lunch bell went, I suddenly got up as if to make my way to the dining room. And Swami Supriyanandaji laughed at me and he said, see, you're Advaita. Aren't you eating through all of these mouths? It's a reference to something Sri Ramakrishna heard from the Divine Mother. And yet you think you must go and eat? Aren't you satisfied eating through all these people? As they eat, you too eat. For you are that reality which can never say, I am not. The moment you say I am, that I am includes all amness, all being. Right? So that's a very broad idea of selfhood. It's a grand claim, very hard to live. So what most Advaita traditions will do is they will suggest that the world is illusory. Either it's void or it's an illusion, and in a particular rarefied state of meditation, this illusion vanishes, and you abide, you're absorbed in your oneness. Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. Then you become aware of who you really are, and you abide in that. But there's no more world. This Advaita is a little bit more radical because it seeks to include the world. So instead of saying the world is an illusion, it says the world is a real manifestation of the one, albeit in a variegated way. So like gold might appear as many ornaments, just like that, the one gold, which is Shiva, playfully appears as all the wonderful ornaments in the world. And they're all still gold through and through, which paradoxically allows you to enjoy the ornaments also as unique instantiations of the one reality. It's a very subtle doctrine, and it's my favorite. So unfortunately, there's a bit of a bias in our conversations. I always only ever talk about it. But I think I'm doing you a bit of a disservice actually, because it's one of many flavors in Tantra. Tantra is an ocean, like it's huge. It's a tropical rainforest with so many different varieties of flowers. And it's so sad that I picked one flower and I'm like, this is the most fragrant one. Everyone smell it with me. It's my favorite flower. But it doesn't mean there aren't other flowers that are equally, if not more so fragrant, depending on the kind of person you are. So again, there are like 60 so-called individuals in the room. Each one of you will resonate with something different. In fact, even in the course of this lecture, each one of us here will resonate with like a different aspect of what we're talking about. And that's the way it should be. So as many people, there should be that many ways to approach God. And so speaking in a maximally diverse way has always been our purpose and our intention in our community. That's why it's nice to talk about Mother Mary and Mary of Magdala. It's nice to talk about the Buddha. We just celebrated Tibetan New Year. And so we talked about Milarepa, like that. It's nice to talk about different traditions, Kabbalah, just to see the same thing from different points of view. That being said though, I always tend to sooner or later defer to Advaita Shaiva. And I hope that in today's conversation, at least we can resist that urge a little bit to explore some of the other facets of Shaivism that we haven't really talked about before. So I think this will be a few lectures. Obviously, there's a lot to cover, and I think there are 8 major systems at least within the non-dual Shaiva Tantra world. Within the Shaiva world, some of those are dualistic. Some of those are qualified non-dualism, which is a term that we'll explore a bit together. And some of them are non-dualistic. And they're all wonderful expressions of this tradition known as Shaivism. So there are 8 systems, and they can be mapped chronologically in a sense of like a historical progression of ideas. And the beauty is that it's all cumulative. So the later traditions depend on the traditions that came before. That's the beautiful thing about Shaivism, is that you could study a non-dual text from Kashmir circa 1100s like that, and you'll find an idea in like a Pāśupata verse from way back when, and you'll see there's a link between the two of them. Even though at first glance they seem to be different philosophies with different soteriologies, different epistemologies, different metaphysics like that, you'll find that there is indeed, throughout the entire tradition, a kind of coherence. And this is what I find people doing. They tend to cherry pick, and that's fine. So they'll take a tradition that they like, but often when they approach it in a kind of ungrounded way, because they are either unaware or purposefully ignoring all that came before. So part of my project here is to explore these 8 systems of Shaivism in a chronological order, but also to point out that it's not necessarily a doxographical hierarchy of revelation. That's not entirely orthodox of me to say, because it's usually presented as a doxographical hierarchy. So I'll explain that word first. I'll put it in the chat. Doxographical hierarchy. Now see, hierarchy means some things are higher than other things. Some things are higher, some things are lower. Like a hierarchy implies that the top is better and the bottom is not so good. And you have to transcend the bottom to get to the top. But doxographical refers to doctrines. Doxographical as in various doctrines are arranged in a kind of hierarchy, with the most non-dual ones being at the top and the most dualistic ones being at the bottom. Almost giving you the impression that the non-dual ones are the best, the most refined and the most exalted and the most essentialized revelations of Lord Shiva. In fact, that's not entirely untrue to say, because Lord Shiva himself says that in some of these non-dual scriptures. He does himself say, all that came before, that's good, but this is the best. He himself will make such claims. And the exegetical authors, or I should say the eisegetical authors, and this is another category that I think is really, really good. Exegetical versus eisegetical. These are academic terms, of course, but they mean something very important for us. Exegetical means explaining a text. So anytime you comment upon a primary source, like an agama, like a tantra, like an Upanishad, you're performing exegesis. You're explaining the text. But notice, anytime you do an exegesis, it's probably going to be from your point of view, from the school of philosophy which you most like and which you were initiated into. So it tends to be more eisegetical. Eisegetical is when you try to explain a text from specifically your point of view. In fact, that's what happens with the Paramarthasara. We're studying that together on Friday mornings. That's our GMT-friendly time. Because many of our EU and UK friends, they've been complaining, and rightly so, that they can't come to these classes because they tend to be at night. Those of you who are in San Diego, San Francisco, those of you who are in the west coast of Canada, no problem. BC folk are like, cool, I stay up late anyway. But our East Coast Sangha, very hard, because it'll be like 10 o'clock now for them, 10:30 now. And some of these people wake up very early for sadhana. And for those who are in Europe, it's like 3, 4 in the morning. I know, because when we were doing our Sangha tour in Europe, like in Switzerland, I would do these calls, and in Germany and in Amsterdam, and I'd be like, it's 4 in the morning, I have to go and turn on the Zoom. The last thing you want to do at 4 in the morning is like look at a Zoom screen with this light coming, So we started a Friday morning class for our friends in the UK and in EU, which would be their evening time. So at that class, we're studying the Paramarthasara of Abhinavagupta. So this is the essence on the ultimate reality. Parama, Artha, Sara. The essential teaching on the highest truth. That's the translation of the name of the text. And there, in verse 2 and 3, verse 3 specifically, Abhinavagupta says, I am now going to recast this text, which existed before him, in the form known as the Adhara Karakas. I'm going to recast it, I'm going to retell it and reinterpret it in the light of non-dual Shaivism. Shaiva Darshana. He doesn't actually say non-dual Shaivism, but of course he's going to teach Advaita, non-duality, but instead he says just Shaiva Sashana. I'm going to teach this, but from the point of view of Shiva Drishti, I think is the word that he uses, Shiva Drishti, from the view of Lord Shiva. Now that's like explicitly eisegetic in nature. He's saying, I'm going to explain, but according to my own school. So we tend to do that. When we explain a text, we explain things eisegetically. In any case, when you're doing an eisegesis, when you're explaining a text, you tend to privilege your school over the other schools. You might recognize those schools as also being valid to some extent, but you place yours above them. So many times you'll hear the claim that dualism is the first revelation of Lord Shiva, followed by qualified non-dualism, which is a slightly higher revelation, and the highest revelation, the most rarefied doctrine, the one that is fit for only the most capable student, is Advaita, non-dual Shaivism. So you get what is called a doxographical hierarchy. Now I want to avoid that kind of thinking. In fact, Acharya Ji, Staneshwar Timalsina, made a very good point. He said, if you say one school is correct and the other schools are wrong or less correct, then you're saying Shiva tells the truth with one of his faces and he lies with the other four faces. You see, because each of these schools come from one of the five faces of Lord Shiva. So it can't be that Lord Shiva reveals X in one moment, reveals Y in another moment, and then reveals Z in a third moment, only to say that only Z is correct and Y and X are wrong. Then Lord Shiva would be a liar. He would be purposefully trying to delude. And that, of course, doesn't sit well with many devotees of Lord Shiva. And yet these same devotees will claim that their school is better than every other school, forgetting the very obvious fact that all these schools were revealed by Lord Shiva, the very definition of Tantra. Agamat Panchavaktrebhya, that which is revealed by the five faces of Lord Shiva to Girija, to Parvati. So it's important to remember that when I talk about these 8 systems of Shaivism, as I intend to do over the course of the next however many weeks, I don't mean to put them in a doxographical hierarchy, although that's sometimes the way that we present these things. Rather, I like to think of them in terms of a chronological sequence. How about that? So some schools were earlier than others. Doesn't mean they're less sophisticated though. It doesn't mean that they're worse. Sometimes the later schools are so indebted to the former schools that we might even consider the former schools more prior in terms of importance. Without them, there wouldn't be the later schools. It sometimes brings to mind Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's hotly debated as to what exactly the needs are and whatnot. But it's not like Maslow is saying self-actualization is the one and only goal. You can't have that without food and shelter and emotional support and education and all the other things that a human might need in order to live a fulfilling life. Now, some people who look at Maslow's hierarchy might say, at the top of the hierarchy is self-actualization. Therefore, I should forget all the other stuff and just try to get that. It won't work. It won't be stable. That self-actualization is built upon every other thing in your life having been, to some extent, satisfied, either in this or in previous lives. Beggars can't renounce, for instance. So it's interesting because this happens a lot in spirituality. We neglect the foundations. We go straight to that which we think is the best, the highest, which can often be a very unstable way of going at it. You see. So, in presenting a chronology of ideas, saying, okay, these came first, these came later, I might also be saying that these are foundational to the ones that came later. And without grounding in these ones, it might be hard to attain those later ones. In fact, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna would say this, that it's an insult to preach religion to an empty stomach. What India needs is not religion, it's bread. They have religion enough. But because of 700 years of Mughal rule and because of colonial, the British Raj and all of that, like India has suffered a lot. Its grand 9,000-year-old civilization was in decline for a long time. And so what India needs is material help. So Swami Vivekananda started hospitals and dispensaries and women's education movements and all sorts of things in rural India to bring up India's material condition so that they could better understand their own spirituality. Whereas in America, there's a lot of luxury here. Even the poorest person in America is sometimes richer than some middle-class people in India. That being said, America hungers for Advaita, for spirituality. So sometimes it's asked, why did Swami Vivekananda teach Advaita, non-duality, in America, when in India, Advaita is considered a very secret doctrine? In fact, when Ramakrishna Paramahansadev, Swami Vivekananda's guru, was instructing him in Advaita, he would lock all the doors and make sure they were alone so that no one else would get access to this stuff, because it's very, very advanced and it can be misunderstood. In the best case, it's not understood at all, at which point you've just wasted your time. No big deal. But at the worst, it can be misunderstood, and it can actively set you back in spiritual life. So this information is generally quite guarded. It's quite secret. It's Gupta, Guhya, Vidya, secret knowledge. But Swami Vivekananda, from the platforms all over this country, just preached it, as if to say that they have the material luxury in order to be able to renounce it. Something like that. So you can't deny that the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is not necessarily a hierarchy. It's a progression of life. It's a remarkable thing. So with that framework, I want to approach this project. I want to say that without grounding in Pāśupata ideology, not necessarily practice, but ideology, without some grounding in the Siddhānta, it's going to be difficult to appreciate, even on a philosophical level, the material of the Trika, or of the Krama, or of these non-dual Shaiva systems that I like to talk about. Kali is standing on Shiva. And you know what the problem is? One very, very astute Brahmin pointed this out to me one time. He's like my favorite. Of all the Brahmins in the world, he's my favorite Brahmin. Because he's not just, versed in our age-old traditions. He's a very dynamic thinker. I won't say his name. But he said one time to me that one problem that you have is that people come to your community and they want Kali, but they don't want Shiva. In other words, they go straight to the juiciest stuff that you're offering. All this non-dual, Shakta Tantra stuff. And it's no wonder that some of these people blow out. You know, we've had a lot of cases, not that many, but enough for me to wonder, like, what's going wrong in the presentation of this material? Why is it not as sustainable as it could be? And then it hit me. See, I didn't come to Kali until many years of Shaiva Siddhānta. I was born into Shaiva Siddhānta. As a fish would take to water, I took to Shaiva Siddhānta. My whole life was in Shaiva Siddhānta. And then the Kali stuff really hit as a kind of specialized revelation. And then in our conversation, we realized that if you get Kali without Shiva, you have energy without ground, in a sense. She's standing on Shiva, you see. But if you have Shiva without Kali, then you have ground with no meaning. They're related like the word and its meaning. The two go together and they're two aspects of one. But typically we like to come to one and dismiss the other. Either Shiva without Shakti or Shakti without Shiva. And part of my project here is to move towards something that captures a firm foundation and yet is willing to reach into the Empyrean heights of Advaita. So in presenting these 8 systems of Shaivism, I'd like to make a case for foundations first. So much so that this lecture could be called the 8 systems of the 8 systems of Shaivism, or 8 systems of Tantra, or 8 schools of Tantra. It's one of the things we could call this lecture. I probably won't call it that because we won't cover all 8 today. We'll need many more lectures to be able to fully dive into things like Veera Shaivism, Lingayat Shaivism, like that. But I prefer to call tonight's lecture How to Practice Tantra Safely, or How to Practice Tantra Meaningfully, which is essentially a case for foundations first. You know, to make sure you're rooted in stability before you start to dance. Like that. Okay, so that's my project. But also, another thing I'm thinking about beyond this is that it was just Shiva Ratri. Part of why we're doing this lecture is because we're still all of us basking in the afterglow of Shiva Ratri. We spent not 1, but 2 nights, some of us, because the way that the chips fell this time around was such that we had 2 Shivaratris. The Shivaratri started at 11:40 p.m. Pacific time, I think, on Tuesday, the 25th, which meant that you could have observed Shivaratri Tuesday and Tuesday night going into Wednesday, or you could observe Shivaratri Wednesday going into Thursday night. We just decided to do both. So we fasted both days and stayed up both nights, which was the most I think the most I've ever actively stayed up in my life. Like 2 all-nighters back to back with a lot of dancing and singing and lecturing. And it was beautiful. The whole thing was so easeful because of the enthusiasm and the joy. We were also adrenalized. Some of you saw us on Thursday though. We were a bit off. We were feral and also we were at peace, but the body was in pieces. So definitely it's not something you can do a lot. And it can be very ungrounding if you do this a lot. But at least once in a year, you know, we ball out for Lord Shiva. We go all out. We fast all day, stay up all night, sing and dance like the ghosts in the cremation ground, mad with joy, drinking the liquor of devotion. So because we had that experience together, Shiva Ratri, by the way, at the end of this lecture, I hope we can all check in with one another. I wanted to do it Thursday, but we were all like, achoo, achoo, so we couldn't really do it. And then I wanted to do it Friday, but also because Ramakrishna Jayanti was that weekend, we didn't get a chance. So hopefully today, after our lecture, we can ask some questions, but more importantly, we can check in with one another. How was your Shiva Ratri is essentially the question I'm interested in asking. That's coming up. So we had Shivaratri. Now, during Shivaratri, we're immersed in thoughts of Shiva. And so I want to ride that wave a little bit, if you don't mind. So basking in the afterglow of Shivaratri, I thought we should ask some questions about Shaivism. After all, Tantra emerges from Shaivism. And so we can talk about Tantra in its origin state, in its primordial state. So I want to have a Shivaratri lecture. I want to talk about Shiva. But also, very importantly, it was Ramakrishna Jayanti on Saturday, the birthday of our Parampara Guru, Sri Ramakrishna. And I was just joking before we started the recording. Usually when it's an auspicious day, I will spam. I will send messages on the Discord. I'll write it out. I write about it on the Patreon. I'll go on Instagram. I'll be like, this is an auspicious day. So much so that some of you have memed it. It's pretty memeable, I guess. And you're like, oh, let me guess. It's an auspicious day again. Like, when is it not? Right? There's always, and thank God for that. There's always something to celebrate. There's always something special. But on literally the most auspicious day for us, Ramakrishna's Jayanti, I didn't say a word. I didn't go on Instagram. I didn't post about it on Patreon. I didn't even talk about it in the Discord. At most, I hurriedly posted a song that we had composed for Ramakrishna on Instagram. That was like the most I could do. But it was hard for us to really say anything about it because of the fervor. We were all swept up in the joy and the fervor of worship that we forgot all about Sangha and about the internet and all of that. So therefore, I didn't really get to talk about Sri Ramakrishna. And today's lecture, I think, specifically will be about Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dev. That's another sankalpa I had to talk about Sri Ramakrishna in some new way. We've talked about him in so many different ways, and he is an inexhaustible subject. So you can talk about him all you want, and you'll never come close to understanding him. Swarupam twadiyam na vindanti devaha. Not even the gods understand what he is. In fact, it's telling because Swami Vivekananda only spoke about him, I think, formally, publicly twice. And even then, once in a serious way, but usually he kept away from the subject. Everything he said, he claimed to have come from Sri Ramakrishna, but he himself wouldn't talk about Sri Ramakrishna. And when Girish Chandra Ghosh, asked him to compose a biography on Sri Ramakrishna, after all, Swami Vivekananda is the foremost disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, who would be more up to the task of interpreting Ramakrishna than Swami Vivekananda. And he said, I can, he gave a list of all powerful things that he could do, So I can dry up the oceans, but don't ask me to do this. This is outside of my power. In trying to describe him, I fear I might make a monkey out of a Shiva. And that's a reference to sculpting. Sometimes when you want to sculpt a murti of Lord Shiva, if you're not a very good sculptor, you'll end up with a monkey. So he's saying, I don't want to turn Shiva into a monkey. I don't want to turn Ramakrishna into a caricature. So Vivekananda, the very articulate, eloquent preacher of Sri Ramakrishna's message, was himself silent about Sri Ramakrishna. And there's something else to be said about this too. He didn't want to present Sri Ramakrishna as a fella. It's almost like in religion, it's all about a fella and that fella's book, which is the degeneration of religion. Because then we forget all about that fella's message, his teaching, and we fail to live that teaching because we're too obsessed with the person, right? So that's the problem. The personal aspect of religion sometimes can be very edifying, very nourishing because we are people, and so as people we respond best to other people. So we want a Jesus, we want a Buddha, we want a Ramakrishna, but sometimes our hankering after the person can occlude what the person is saying. We get into a kind of cult of worship. So part of why Swami Vivekananda didn't want to talk about Sri Ramakrishna was because he was afraid he would start a new religion. In other words, he would present a new cult into the world. And he said there were cults enough, as it was. So why like pit my Ramakrishna against your Jesus or something like that? The claim is that Ramakrishna, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Rama, these are all avataras. They are human expressions of the divine, and they are the strongest manifestations of divinity known to us in this embodied reality. In fact, if all of reality can be considered the cow, if God is a cow, Indians, we are obsessed with cows, then the avatāra is the udder. You can get the cow's milk only from the udder. So go straight to the source. Go to the udder. That's the claim. And Ramakrishna is the udder. But in talking about Ramakrishna, in talking about this strongest of all manifestations of divinity, you're always in danger of misinterpreting him, misunderstanding him, or putting him into some kind of box, making an Advaita Vedantin out of him, or a Tantric out of him, or a Vaishnava out of him. He is all of these things and so much more. The mind cannot even begin to grasp it. That being said, you cannot speak of him. And maybe one should not for fear of turning Shiva into a monkey. Lakan is funny. Hanuman? Right. So, in fact, my guru said something really, really stunning the other day. He said, Vivekananda is an avatar. He's an avatar. He's an incarnation of God. Sri Ramakrishna is an avatari. He is the one in whom all avatars inhere. If avatars are like waves, Sri Ramakrishna is the ocean. He's Avatara Varishta. So this doctrine of the Avatara is also really complex, really deep. It can be articulated from within Vaishnavism in one way, from within Gaudiya Vaishnavism in another way, from within Tantra in yet another way. So we have to understand a lot about the Avatara to even begin talking about Sri Ramakrishna. And that's also a project that we're interested in. We did a few lectures some time ago talking about Jesus and Mary and how does the Avatara come with his Shakti and what actually is the God as man, as person, I mean. How does that, is that a manifestation of Shiva? No, it's a manifestation of Shakti. Like all of that stuff. All that wonderful Avatara Vada, the doctrine and theology of the Avatar, that's like a necessary prerequisite even for going into a topic like Sri Ramakrishna. So it's hard to talk about Sri Ramakrishna. We've done it in a few different ways here and there. And I was thinking, how can we talk about him today to celebrate him, just to marinate our minds in this mystery in a way that we haven't yet before? And I had this idea. Since it was Shiva Ratri and since it was Ramakrishna's Jayanti, I thought, wouldn't it be cool to map the progression of ideas in Tantra, in Shaivism, onto the life of Sri Ramakrishna? Because the stunning thing about Sri Ramakrishna is you find everything there. All forms of religious ideology. The Christians saw him as the Christ. The followers of Guru Nanak, the Sikhs, saw him as Guru Nanak incarnate. The Shaktas saw him as a Tantric par excellence. The Advaita Vedantins found in him the paragon of Kevala Advaita. The yogis saw him as a master yogi. Like that, everybody, whatever you bring to him, you see in him. He has that diversity. And that being said, we could you'll see on Chaitanya Jayanti, we're going to go into a kind of Gaudiya Vaishnava take on Sri Ramakrishna. And you'll see that, like, from that lecture, you'll get the impression that he's a Gaudiya Vaishnava. He's Chaitanya. Actually, he's Chaitanya in the mood of Nityananda. And Nityananda is a character I can't wait to introduce you to. He's a Tantrik with Jata, worshipping a Shiva Lingam, an emerald Shiva Lingam, and a Sri Chakra. At the Kali Mandir in Laguna Beach, there's a beautiful painting of him with his lingam and with his Sri Chakra in his jata, with his skull cup. Actually, it's a coconut cup, which represents a skull cup. And he's basically naked except for a blue cloth. So I can't wait to introduce you to Nityananda, who is the Tantric Vaishnava par excellence. And you'll see Sri Ramakrishna, he can really be understood from the context of, from the point of view of Chaitanya and Nityananda and Gaudiya Vaishnavism and all of that. And he could also really be understood from the point of view of Christianity and yoga. There's no end to Sri Ramakrishna. He's Ananta Paripurnam. Absolutely delightful to talk about, because you can just come at it from so many different ways. That being said, though, there's something about his life, his biography, that allows you to learn something about the progression of religion as a whole. And in Sri Ramakrishna's life, I think we can map these ideas, these Shaiva ideas, chronologically in a way that I think will be more meaningful because we can see them acted out in the theater of a single individual's life, which is, I think, to me, a really, really exciting project. So that's what I want to do in part in today's lecture. Let's see how far we get. There's a lot to cover, of course. It's a grand life and it's a grand philosophy. And to bring philosophy and person together is what the avatāra is for. An avatāra is a living expression of philosophy, which brings me to maybe a more important point. The reason why we don't talk about Ramakrishna, or the reason we do, but the reason why Vivekananda probably didn't talk about Ramakrishna was because it was more important to him that we understand the principles and lived it than that we had blind adherence to a person. Not to say that isn't spiritually meaningful and nourishing. That's a big part of devotion, to be attached to a particular form, an adorable form that we delight in each day. But more importantly, we have to marinate our minds in that which the form represents. So that being said, this project is quite cool because in mapping these ideas onto the trajectory of Sri Ramakrishna's life, we get a nice play of principle and person, I think, with the emphasis always being on principle. Okay, that's my project. That's my introduction. And it took me all of 48 minutes to do. Okay, but now let's start. And we should start, obviously, with the very beginning, which is the Veda, the Holy Veda. In fact, I'll point you to the Discord. You'll see that in the Discord, I've put a sort of map. And of course, this is just notes that I took on my phone today in the car on the way here. So it's obviously not organized. So some of these I took down some time ago and posted here. So some of this might be familiar to those of you who have been coming to these classes, but much of this is new. I've put some new stuff in here, particularly with reference to texts, because the way we are going to map this chronological, hierarchical, doxographical sequence is through the texts and through the commentators of those texts. Because the thing about Sanskrit literature, which I really love, is that it's a very rich literature. There's a lot of textual data that we can draw from to make these claims. So we're not just speaking out of our own butt. We can point to something and say, here, it's grounded in this particular tradition, which is rooted in this particular text. So the texts are very important to me because the texts mean integrity. Integrity to our lineage, integrity to history, stuff like that. Because the texts are a kind of record of ideas as they appear in history. The sad thing in religion is that, they say, if you go to university, you have to read many books to be called smart. But the sad thing about religion is usually you tend to read one book and in language other than what it was written in, and then they say you're holy. Isn't that funny? I think that's something problematic. We're reading a book in a translation without ever having access to the Hebrew or Aramaic, without ever understanding the cultural context in which that book was written, without ever consulting the rich commentarial tradition around that work, and then claiming that we're Christians. How can we say we follow the words of the Christ when we don't even know what the Christ said? We're denying that John the Evangelist, not John the Apostle, but John the Evangelist, wrote 150 years after the Christ. We're all in denial about the fact that most of the literature that we have on the Buddha emerged hundreds of years after the Buddha. So how can we follow the Buddha? How can we follow the Christ when our textual sources are not prioritized? And that's a nice thought, that what we're going to do is we're going to track these ideas using the texts. So I'm going to name a bunch of texts. Of course, these are all Sanskrit names. To the best of my ability, I'll try to translate those Sanskrit names into English so you get a sense of what those texts are about. But the texts are important. And staying close to the text gives me, I hope, a kind of integrity. So we can cite our sources and you can call me out on anything. So I'm going to try to interpret, and I'm commenting upon these texts, and more importantly, it's a kind of meta commentary. So I'm not commenting upon the text, but I'm commenting upon the trajectory of textual sources. But the way to keep this discussion grounded, and I think actually factual, is to stay close to the text. So that's kind of my commitment in our community, is to stay text based. But, one thing is, like, charismatic teachers always say, you don't need books, you can't learn this from books. It's a very dangerous thing to say, because the moment you dismiss all text, you've dismissed all accountability. Then what you say becomes law, becomes text, like that. So I think a guru should have a guru, and I think you should know your guru's guru. And more importantly, I think you should know your guru's guru's guru. And much more importantly, I think you should know your guru's 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 guru. In other words, you should know your parampara. Because without that parampara, a person can say whatever they want and pretend that it's credible. And in some cases, it might be. I'm not saying that it's not, but it's a dangerous thing. It's a risky business. So that being said, this happens a lot in Buddhism and Hinduism. Because at least in Christianity, there's a lot of emphasis on text, but specifically on a text. In Islam also, there's a lot of emphasis on text, and also the hadith, the commentarial tradition that comes with the Quran. And Catholicism is interesting in that way, because they do also have a rich commentarial tradition like Aquinas and Augustine and whatnot. So that's good, right? But you don't get a lot of charismatic teachers. There's so much emphasis on the text that you don't get living representations of the text who can actually transmit the spirit of the text. But conversely, in other traditions, you get living transmitters of the tradition, but without any felicity of or adherence to the text. I think both would be great. I think if the two forces combine, that'll be really nice. Okay, having said all of that, this will be very text-oriented and very textually driven. And one of the main sources of citation that I'll be using for Sri Ramakrishna's life is obviously the Leela Prasanga, which was composed by Swami Saradananda, one of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. But even here, there are some textual problems. It's a great text because it's written by a direct disciple who has not only been with Sri Ramakrishna and seen these states in Sri Ramakrishna, but who has himself verified those states through his own personal experience. In one place, Swami Saradananda makes the bold claim that I've never written about anything that I myself have not experienced, which is a remarkable claim. It speaks more to his guru than to his own greatness, and that's the beauty of it. Because he's the direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he was able to attain, the very highest in Sri Ramakrishna. Which Ramakrishna had to offer. And therefore, he can speak about it with some authority. And I love the text, the Leela Prasanga. In fact, it's been translated a few different times. One by Swami Jagadananda. It's called Sri Ramakrishna, the Great Master. That was one of the early translations of the Leela Prasanga into English. Then followed by Swami Chetan Anandaji's masterpiece, Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play. These are translations of the Leela Prasanga. It's a wonderful text, perhaps the best and most authoritative text on the life of Sri Ramakrishna. And this life, of course, happened before the Katamrita to a great extent. So you can't just go to the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and expect to know about Sri Ramakrishna's life. In fact, the reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is informed and in some ways made more meaningful by grounding in the Leela Prasanga. But the Leela Prasanga is a difficult text. It's a very mystically exalted text. Things are explained there that require a lot of spiritual maturity to understand. So that's a difficult text, and so many other biographies on Sri Ramakrishna have come out, kind of as introductory text to the Leela Prasanga. So before you attempt the Leela Prasanga, which is available in English as Sri Ramakrishna and his Divine Play, you might want to start with a text like Sri Ramakrishna and his Disciples by Dayamata. Oh my God. Sorry, Devamata. Somebody else actually. Sister Devamata, she wrote this beautiful little biography. It's like so small. It's like this. Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples. And then also Christopher Isherwood put out another book called Ramakrishna and his disciples. So somewhat confusingly, there are these two books, Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples, and maybe a bit in competition, Ramakrishna and his disciples. And both the books offer a different flavor. The important thing is both the books were written by Americans. Both Sister Devamata is interesting because she lived in India, in Madras, and she met many direct disciples. She met Swami Brahmananda and Swami Ramakrishnanandaji. She was very close to Swami Ramakrishnanandaji. So her writing has a deep, deep authenticity to it. It's very beautiful, very moving book. It's called Sri Ramakrishna and his Disciples. So that's one of my favorite books on Sri Ramakrishna outside the Leela Prasanga. You might want to start with that. And you might, if you're really interested, you might also want to read Christopher Isherwood's Sri Ramakrishna and his Disciples. They're both very readable and very like Western audience friendly. Whereas the Great Master or the Leela Prasanga, the Divine Play, That's pretty difficult. It's written by an Indian, Swami Saradananda, and written in Bengali and translated expertly, mind you, but that doesn't really take from some of the difficulty of the text. But it's profound. It's one of the greatest spiritual things I've ever written read next to the Katamrita or the complete works of Swami Vivekananda. It's one of my favorites. So this is the main source from which we are drawing our statements on Sri Ramakrishna. But also, another book that I really like is Schiffman's Ramakrishna, Prophet of a New Age. Wait, I just had it somewhere. I should have brought these books with me so I can show them to you. Anyway, I'll put them in the description of this video so you can check out the bibliography for this project. But you might like to check that book out also. It's by Schiffman. And one of the authorities at Bellarmine said, we don't really know very much about this Schiffman, which lends credibility to the book. He's just like kind of like a rando almost. No one really knows very much about him. We don't really know if he's part of the lineage or what his affiliation really is to the Ramakrishna order. He just put out this book, and it's an awesome book. It's an introductory book, but written in a very beautiful and very devotional way, I think. So, Sri Ramakrishna, Prophet for the New Age by Schiffman, and Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples by Sister Deva Mata, and also Ramakrishna and his disciples. These are good introductory books before you attempt the Leela Prasanga. But most of what we're going to be talking about tonight is from the Leela Prasanga and or from oral transmission, from what I've heard from various sadhus in and outside of the Ramakrishna lineage and mission. So that's going to be the textual basis for our claims about Sri Ramakrishna. I just want to start by flagging that and putting that on the table. After talking about all this like importance of textual data, I better like cite my sources here as to what, works cited, exactly my works cited. And then some people won't like this. They'll be like, I came for like, I want a spiritual hit. I want some kind of, I am God, everything is God. Oh, I want like a hit. And then I want to go and like forget about it tomorrow, you know? So you'll notice the moment we start doing this more grounded kind of work, people get turned off. They're like, that's not what I wanted actually. What I wanted was something kind of sensational. It's very telling. I've noticed it's something that we are afraid to do this kind of work because it's tedious in a way, but it's not if you love the subject. Anyway, so we'll start with that. These are the sources cited for my Sri Ramakrishna portion. Then for my Shaivism portion, I'll name the citations as I go. I'll name the sources as we go because there are many, many, many texts and they're specific to each of these traditions. So again, my goal is to cover the 8 systems of Shaivism. I'm not going to cover them all today, and I'm not going to be able to do any one of these systems that much justice. I would like to get into the nuts and bolts of the system and analyze its philosophy and compare its philosophies to the other schools, which is maybe a project for another evening. In fact, next week, I want to talk about Veera Shaivism, some of the very interesting dual come non-dual traditions in Shaivism. Abheda, it's called. Bheda Shaivism. And we don't really talk about that. It's an underrepresented school, as I was saying in the beginning of the lecture. So next week, we'll talk a bit more about Bheda. Today, I'll talk a little bit more about Bheda, dualistic Shaivism, dualism, Shaiva dualism, which is also really beautiful and delightful. Again, a subject that we can go into with much more depth on another occasion. Today, I'm just going to map all of these things using Sri Ramakrishna's life as the ultimate example. Okay. So, one more disclaimer I wanted to make. You know, one of the saddest things is that many people come to spiritual life seeking solutions to all of their like psychological issues, their worldly problems. They're hoping that something about spirituality will give them support in daily life. And it's true, it does do that. However, for some of the more esoteric things, the maybe more dramatic practices of Tantra, basic psychological wellness is already a prerequisite. So you can't come into these practices hoping for a remedy for psychological ailments or for social ailments or for physical ailments, because that can be had through other forms of spirituality maybe. These things take as their basic prerequisite a sound body and a sound mind. Without a basic sense of psychological wellness, without this kind of being socially adjusted, being comfortable in one's own body, comfortable in one's own mind, without a basic sense of ease in your experience of embodiment, it's quite easy to get a reaction from spiritual life, especially from things like Tantra. Is that fair to say? Now, a lot of times this sounds like very exclusionary. It's like, oh, until I get a basic sense of physical wellness. It's not that hard, actually. You know, some people just drink water or something. The things that you are going to be doing are much harder. And so if we can't even do that, that's why some people are always like, oh my God, what if I get a siddhi? I don't want to get a siddhi lest I misuse it. I was joking with Jess the other day. We were in the car driving to Topanga. It's never going to be quite as funny as when we sit in the car, Jess, because Jess is, of course, a professional comedian. But it's like, Baba, don't worry about siddhis. Just sort your taxes out first. So it's like if we can't even keep our lives together, our like basic human life in this world together, then it's going to be very difficult to do these disciplines that require a lot of executive function and a lot of presence and a lot of grounding like that. So it's almost as if success in this world is a prerequisite for success in spiritual worlds. Unfortunately, though, when people find social interactions uncomfortable because of their social anxiety, they default to substances and or to spirituality. You know, this, I think today we call this a kind of spiritual bypassing. We sense our inadequacies in the world, and as a way to avoid feeling inadequate, we then go to spiritual life and find world negating narratives, which give us some justification for why we aren't succeeding in the world. Oh, it's not for us because it's fundamentally flawed. It's not me. I'm not the problem in my relationships. My relationships and the world in which they inhere, that's the problem. And my spirituality gives me ample data for that. Right? So I'm worried about this. I'm worried that the juicy parts of what we talk about, like Kali and Tantra and the 12 Kalis, you, we salivate when we come to that stuff because it's so profound and so powerful. And time again, I see people playing with fire. Again, I'm not scaring you, but time and time again, I see people playing with fire and burning out. They might go for like a year or two or three. But again, I've been doing this all my life. And some people have been doing this for 70, 80 years. And at this point, you can kind of tell when a person is going to be here for 2 years or 3 years or 2 minutes or 2 days. And that's not what I want to have. Everyone has their own karmas. But I mean, there should be some more sustainability, not just in our community, I think, but in spirituality in general. So I want to present more tools, not just all the juicy, cool tantric stuff, because of course that's what everyone mostly comes for. But I also want to present some tools and some doctrines, even some context for grounding. It takes maybe a little more than just tapping, although sometimes it's simpler than even that. So, of course, good nutrition, like just eating well and being strong in the body, good exercise, drinking enough water, getting enough sleep, sorting out your stuff with substances. Another thing is, when we do certain tantric rituals, say you offer ganja to Lord Shiva or something, that can work for a certain kind of person. But for another kind of person, the moment they do that, they plunge into substance abuse problems. You know, so like I'll suggest friends, I'll say like, oh, on Shiva Ratri night, we'll smoke a few cigarettes, it'll keep us up. Somebody else might start that and be hooked to cigarettes. You know, like we all have a different relationship. Like some person, like we can smoke a cigarette and never think about it again for the rest of the year. You know, we can offer a little bit of ganja to Lord Shiva and maybe even partake of it a little bit and never think about it for the rest of the week or the rest of the year, you know. But other people, the moment they hear about this, oh, offering ganja to Lord Shiva or offering wine to Ma Kali kind of thing, that gives them, I think, the avenue for deepening their substance abuse problems, unfortunately now in the name of spirituality. Ma Kali likes to be offered wine. It says so in the Tantras. You give Lord Shiva in the form of Bhairava, bhang and also cigarettes and also whiskey. But it's not everybody who can do that sadhana. You know, that kind of sadhana can destroy you if you don't sort out your substance use situation. See, if you are already a servant to your substance and then you bring these kinds of things in, that will reify your bondage. But if you are a master of your substance, then you can use them without them using you. That's why a guru in this tradition must carefully check the psychological fitness of the student to be sure that they won't be entrapped by the same substances that they're using for the purposes of liberation. See, it's a very remarkable thing. Puja can free you or it can trap you. It all depends on how you approach it. And in some ways, it's the guru's job to vet that. But it's hard to do that when there's so many people. You know, sometimes the information is just out there and you can't really control like what people are hearing and how they're hearing it and what they're going to do with what they heard. So part of trying to be responsible is to offer this stuff too. You know, which unfortunately, or fortunately, it's all mother's will at the end. It's usually the stuff that nobody likes to hear. Buzzkill, you know, it's like, oh my God, it's so exclusionary. What, you mean I have to be physically strong and mentally fit before I can come to spiritual life? Yes, Baba. No, maybe I'll step back. Not to spiritual life, but to this particular form of spirituality. We underestimate the psychological and physical maturity that it takes to handle some of these things. So that being said, we should ask a very important question. How's our life? You know, like how's our like character? Are we rising up to the challenges of our life? Are we easily disheartened? Are we discouraged by the things that happen in the world? If we are to practice this kind of tantra, we must be viras. Vira or vira. The gendered noun is not important here. Hero or heroine or hero person. We have to have a heroic temperament. In other words, we have to have a lot of self-control. In other words, we have to be the master of our own mind and our own body, right? That's the thing. And go on practicing. These things, of course, will come, but often we're ready to abandon these things. I like to give this sort of PSA after Shiva Ratri, because Shiva Ratri especially tends to bring out a certain level of eccentricity. Of course, we're staying up all night, we're fasting all day. The Udana Vayu really goes up. And if you're a grounded kind of person, you'll have a nice devotional time. But if already that, and some of us we know, and we know in ourselves also, if that comes, it can throw off the rest of the month or the rest of the year or something like that. So we must pace ourselves. And often it can become a matter of pride. With some of us, we're like, oh, this is being done publicly, so I have to stay up, because otherwise what will people think of me? Or I better fast, because if I have, God forbid, I have a little bit of kir, then people will think I'm unholy or something like that. So the socialization of spirituality becomes a problem too. So often we suggest carefully evaluating one's own life with radical self-honesty and figuring out what ways you might be able to like live better. Just and self-help books will do the trick, or more grounded forms of spirituality, just like a simple bhakti practice or like a simple hygiene practice. It's very funny. Many of us want to transcend rules of purity without first abiding by them. And that's why I think when I map out these 8 schools of Shaivism, you'll see why the transgressive traditions that come later are really so powerful, because they're rooted in the purity principles of the former traditions. Isn't that kind of an interesting idea? And you'll see that a lot of Advaita is rooted in Dvaita, meaning a lot of Jnana is rooted in Bhakti. Bhakti is very stabilizing. So often when people ask, how can I practice spirituality in a stable way? I would say, stick to Bhakti. In other words, sing songs, dance, congregate in a way that's like sensible and holy, and then love God. Start with that. Like love God. And then slowly she herself will take you by the hand and guide you step by step. And this could be it, by the way. Some of you are like, oh, fine. If Kali wants me to moderate my practice, she will tell me. How do you know she isn't right now? I'm not saying I'm speaking for Kali. I'm just saying that sometimes we have to listen to the Mahut Narayan. Everyone is God. And so advice like this, advice from your doctor, advice from your therapist, advice from friends and family, they should not be so quickly dismissed. In some cases they should be, because in many cases they're rooted in the errors of the world. But in some cases, they could be quite helpful actually. The Mahut Narayan. Everyone is God, and therefore advice should be taken seriously. And the advice that we get time and time again in our tradition is root yourself, ground yourself. And so part of my project here is to do that. So I hope you don't mind. Let's start with these various schools of Shaivism, beginning with the Vedas. And part of Vedic living is itself a safeguard for a lot of the more transgressive practices. So abiding by Vedic purity principles can be very, very helpful, which means discernment in like hygiene and company that we keep and what kind of foods we eat, like what kind of media we consume, that kind of discernment, which will all be thrown out the window in Advaita. Right? That kind of discernment should come first, actually. And it's in the Vedas that we tend to get this kind of thing. So the Vedas, as you know, according to Swami Vivekananda, aren't really books, he would often say. And he said early in 1893, in one of his first few lectures here in the West, he said, by Vedas, no books are meant. Vedas are just spiritual knowledge that vibrate in the ether, if you will, and that can be received by anyone, anywhere, with keen perception. So they can be heard, and they come in the form of mantras. But they're prior to mantras even. They're like nada, like a primordial resonance in the universe, and certain people have perceived these. They're called Rsis. Rsis have heard these primordial resonances, and they've translated them, as it were, into mantras. In other words, mantras appear to them. The mantras were revealed to them, not by a particular god, mind you. They inhere in reality. That's another facet, I think, of this tradition that's quite interesting. It's not necessarily God that reveals this stuff as far as the Vedas are concerned. The Vedas are self-revelatory. They just exist. They exist alongside God, if you will. They inhere in primordial reality. It's the structure of reality. And a computer programmer, a computer programmer, Vedic ritualist, not ritualist, but Vedic practitioner, was telling me that computer languages are very much based in the mantras of the Vedas, in a sense. The Vedas are themselves a kind of coding language for the universe, if you will. So think of the Vedas as a source code for the universe, and it's possible to learn this source code. So this is called the Shruti, that which is heard. And the Shruti appears in a few ways. The Rik Veda, the Yajurveda, Rik Veda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharva Veda. These 4 Vedas are the way that they are because they were compiled by someone called Veda Vyasa, the guru of all gurus, like a very important figure in India, because not only did he compile the Vedas, he also allegedly composed the Mahabharata, and he also allegedly composed a commentary on the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. He's a very busy person and a very long-lived person because, works are attributed to him for thousands of years. He's a very important figure, but he was the one who arranged all these hymns, as it were, into these four books. But really, the traditions were kind of independent of one another. And in India, there was this oral tradition that went through the gotras with these lineages. For instance, we don't say Brahma. You might hear some people say Brahma, because it's spelled that way, Brahma, Brahma. It's Brahma. But again, that's not how it's spelled. But that rule comes from something in the Gotras. Brahma. It's spelled Brahma. Often I know somebody is teaching Vedic traditions without a grounding in the Vedas. Not that I mean this in a pejorative sense. It's a light and sweet kind of thing. We shouldn't be fastidious about pronunciation. But this kind of trope, Brahma as opposed to Brahma, that comes from these Gotras, these Vedic lineages, or Vanhi as opposed to Vani. Vanhi means fire, but it's Vanhi or Brahma. These things are not there in the Sanskrit, but they're part of the oral transmission, the way the Vedas are chanted and transmitted throughout history. So these are oral sources that were only written much later. So these are not letters, they're phonemes, they're sounds. And these primordial sounds come in the form of mantras, and when you chant them, you feel the power. You're like, oh my God, this is, especially when many people chant them together, it's intoxicating. At that point, you're like, I can put my ganja aside. I don't even need this 5-MeO DMT because this is, it's intoxicating when you listen to people chanting the Vedas. It's really, really, really powerful stuff. So when I say that these traditions go beyond the Vedas and they transgress the Vedas, sometimes you get the sense that we're demeaning the Vedas. But you have to first understand how powerful the Vedas are to begin with, to be able to properly understand how powerful these non-dual transgressive Kali traditions can be. See, they're even more powerful than that. But in a sense, the Vedas are the source code, the source power of everything. And the Shruti, nothing could be higher than the Shruti. This is the highest authority in, arguably, even in Tantra. In all schools of philosophy, the Shruti is the highest. Okay, so we start with that. But there's also something else that comes. The Smriti. So the Shruti is divinely revealed. The Rishis perceive it, inhering in the fabric of reality. But then from this, they make interpretations. The Smriti then prescribes a way of life that is in keeping with the Shruti. So based on what was revealed in the Karma Kanda and the Jnana Kanda of the Vedas, in the ritual portion and the philosophy portion of the Vedas, a kind of lifestyle can be derived. Now, the Smriti, also known as the Smarta tradition, can evolve as we move throughout various phases in communal life, in cultural life. These smarta rules are subject to change. But very basically, the smarta rules prescribe a grounded life of purity and peace, a simple life. And that life is adjusted to the needs of the individual. So the Smarta tradition then divides life into four sections: your young life, your brahmacharya life, your householder life, your gahasta period, your vanaprastha life when you become a retired person, and your sannyasa life, which is your final stage in life in which you pour all your energies into realizing the absolute. So these are the four ashramas. Then there are these four primordial character types, if you will, like if you're playing D&D or something. It's like the ranger, and there's like the mage, and there's like the melee combat person, like that. There are these four almost archetypical positions that you can play, and they're not hierarchically arranged. It's not like the brahmana is the best and the shudra is the worst. It's not like that at all. Rather, that these are all four perfectly valid roles that you can play in the universe, and in keeping with your ashrama and in keeping with your varna or your caste, certain lifestyle choices are prescribed. Now, this of course will all be transcended later. All this caste stuff and this purity stuff and all these strict codes of conduct, all of this will be totally transgressed by the left hand or by the kaula. But the people who were transgressing them were usually people who were rooted in them. That's, I think, an interesting thing. And so often I wonder, what's the project like if we offer all these transgressive practices without the rooting, without the grounding in which they were first trying to subvert? That's just a thought I had. Again, I'm not committed to this view that you need to master all these prior schools of philosophy before you. I'm fully open to the idea that like any one philosophy will do it. Just like Shiva says in the Vijnana Bhairava, you don't have to learn the whole thing. Just one meditation can do it, depending on your karmas and your sensitivity and whatnot. But I think it's also nice to learn the whole Vijnana Bhairava. Similarly, it's also nice to learn something of Vedic culture and Vedic living, which I think primarily is an emphasis on a structured regimented, mindful sort of life. And that means certain strict dietary things, like for instance in the Manusmriti, one of the Smarta texts, certain food restrictions are given. And again, I'm not going to tell you what they are for fear of like making this about food. It has to be adjusted again to the individual. So one should ask themselves, are there foods that inspire me? And are there foods that take away from my ability to meaningfully live? For some people, that might look like cutting out caffeine or cutting out substances or something like that. For another person, it might mean actually bringing in some caffeine, or I don't know what it might mean for you. But just a kind of conscious, mindful diet is part of a Vedic lifestyle. And also consciousness about time and moon cycles. These are very grounding. To know that today is the 5th day of the waxing moon. Today is Panchami, the 5th day of Shukla Paksha in the month of Falguna. Just to know that, what day of the month it is, what moon cycle it is. And the Gregorian calendar might not be so dependable here because it's not necessarily mapped onto the natural rhythms of nature. So the Vedic calendar, the Jyotisha of the Vedic period, was an attempt to map our lifestyle to the rhythms of nature. And part of that was understanding the moon. And so you have to know at every point what the phase of the moon is, and your conduct, your code of conduct is adjusted to that to some extent. And you have to know what solar house we're in and what the certain moods and rhythms in nature signify for you and for your personal practice. So understanding those rhythms in yourself and learning to align those rhythms with the rhythms of nature, that was, broadly speaking, if I may say so at this point, the project of the Smarta tradition in the Vedas. So Smartaism gets criticized a lot because it tends to be very orthodox and very rule following and very regimented. But there's a time there's a time and place for that, no? So I think that's the idea. The basic idea is that without giving any rules right now, one should have a regulated and regimented life. And one of the most beautiful rituals that have come out, I think, of the Vedic period is the Sandhya Vandana. It's based on the Gayatri Mantra. And the Gayatri Mantra is so crucial because it's one of the most profound mantras of the Vedas. And it's given, of course, in Diksha. And we had a whole lecture on it. I don't know if it's still available since the YouTube ban, but it might be. And if it's not, I think it's lurking around somewhere in my hard drive and I might try to resuscitate it. It's called the Tantric Gayatri Mantra, where we analyze a bunch of different Gayatri mantras attributed to different deities. But this one is called the Savitri Gayatri Mantra. It's like the primordial Gayatri Mantra, if you will. And this Gayatri Mantra is the heart of a particular ritual known as the Sandhya Vandana. Now, we don't need to learn the Sandhya Vandana right now. It's enough to know that there are rituals attributed to certain times of the day, like at dawn and like at dusk. It was almost as if you woke up and observed the dawn, and it was almost as if you observed the dusk, you'll be much better regulated. So remember, Tantra is very powerful because the mantras have a hormonal effect. They literally change our physiology, the mantras themselves. So people chant mantras and they get all sorts of reactions. It's no surprise because they're hormonally imbalanced. And why are we hormonally imbalanced? Because in Switzerland at 4 a.m., I'm looking at a Zoom screen in order to give the Zoom lecture on Vedic regulated living. You know what I mean? Like part of why we're so imbalanced is because our melatonin's all fucked up, our serotonin is all fucked up, our dopamine is all fucked up. Like now we have modern scientific language to describe these movements within us. We call them hormones. Back then, they could perhaps be understood more metaphorically as energies or whatnot. Not to say these things are the same. Obviously, the physical stuff is a reflex or external expression of the subtler stuff, but the subtler stuff, the flow of energy in the body, it can be harnessed by adhering to the cycles of nature. So like a basic practice of waking up before dawn doesn't work for everybody because we have jobs now that require us to stay up all night maybe. So again, be very careful with this kind of stuff because it must be adjusted to meet the needs of your life. We have to be sensible with this kind of thing. But basically, like learning to wake up with the rhythms of nature have a very powerful effect in balancing the hormonal structure of the body. Like going to bed at a certain time and waking up at a certain time and sticking to that. Yeah, and I'm not really helping the case here because those of you who like to wake up early and also want to come to the Monday night class, you're fucked. This is a nice way to ruin your melatonin. And some people, by the way, like specifically make the choice not to come to these classes as much as they want because of this kind of thing. But again, it's not that important that you follow these things to the T. It's more important that you have your own rhythm and structure that works for you. But the rhythm, the regularity, the consistency, the regimented nature of these things, I think is very important. And not only that, being able to align your own daily rhythms with the rhythm of nature, that's important, right? Having a rhythm itself is important, meaning having a regimented life is itself important. But secondly, having discernment as to what we watch and consume, both through the eyes and through the mouth, what we say, Like one thing I notice is that in religious life, spiritual life, gossip is the end of all things. You know, we love to gossip, and it's damaging actually. I should abstain from gossip and then let other people make the choice that they will. But if I notice something is pernicious in in my own life, I have to say no. I have to stop that activity, whatever it might be. So these kind of conscious choices premised upon an adherence to a structured, regular, consistent routine, that might be the very essence of Vedic lifestyle. Of course, lots of things are prescribed in the Vedas, certain rituals and certain things that you do to propitiate certain energies that are both inward and outward in expression. All of that we can talk about. We don't need to talk about though, because the first thing to note now is that the Shruti and the Smriti, the divine revelation and the human interpretation, which is again an attempt to live dharmically, a dharmic life, is essentially a life aligned with Rita. So another important word in the Vedas, it means rhythm, Rita. So to live with the rhythms of nature and the rhythm, not just of physical nature, that's easy, but the rhythms of divine nature. That's wonderful too. And you know, like every day to make an offering to one's own ancestors. That's important. Like a kind of basic ancestor worship is very grounding. A lot of people don't have that, so they seek lineage, spiritual lineage, in order to plug in the gap that they feel with regards to their ancestors. The Vedic tradition gives you specifically the injunction to worship your ancestors, Pitri Tarpana. And then, importantly, you worship the gods. And the gods here is not necessarily capital G God, it's the forces of nature. At the very least, you should have a basic sense of reverence for these forces and propitiate them, like propitiate the sun at certain times in the day, for instance. And then thirdly, the worship of the rishis. Every day, one should study spiritual literature, because that's the way we venerate the rishis from whom this literature came. So we venerate our ancestors, we venerate the gods, we venerate the rishis, then we venerate our culture, our tradition, our community by doing some act of service or some act of charity. So this keeps us, I think, socially engaged, which is really important because many people opt out of doing anything for anybody else and then they want to progress spiritually. It's impossible. It's impossible to progress spiritually when your idea of yourself is so limited. Your idea of yourself must be as maximal as possible and include everyone, meaning you should live a life of service, a life of engagement with community. And finally, to animals. That's interesting too. To nature, to animals, the Vedas instruct us that every day we should do something for the animals. And so you'll find even today in some households, usually it's the grandmother or the auntie. In my case, it was my grandmother. They would go outside and put some sugar on the floor, or put a piece of some rice or some piece of chapati or something on the floor for the ants, because they're fulfilling their Vedic injunctions. They did their puja to the gods and to the ancestors. They studied the Vedas or the Upanishads. They did some act of service by cooking for the family or hosting somebody in the neighborhood who might have lost a spouse. And now they are giving something to the animals. This is basic stuff. But there are people who want to practice high-level Tantra who don't venerate the ancestors, who don't worship the forces of nature and feel a basic reverence for reality, who don't study the Vedas or the Upanishads and marinate their mind in life-giving philosophies, who don't do acts of service and commit themselves to societal engagement, and who don't even take care of animals. Without these basic prerequisites, how then can we attempt all these very, very difficult sadhanas? So it's almost as if we have to start with that, you know? Oh, it's a good question, Paro. You know why? So Paro is asking, why is Swami Vivekananda missing from your shrine? It's a really, really good question. I can give two answers. The first answer is, I know it's not yet the Q&A. I still have quite a bit of material to cover before we can do a Q&A. But my first answer, I think it's an interesting question. My first answer is, because I was traveling one day, and so that little frame where Swamiji and Swami Brahmananda go, I took them out and put Ramakrishna and Ma there so I could take them with me. I just needed the frame. That's why I took them out. But I never returned them because I was in Bellarmine. And by the way, Swamiji once said, if you ever wave incense before me, if you ever worship me, I'll come up behind you as a ghost and snap your neck. The other, like if you go to Bellarmine, in the shrine of Swamiji, there's no image of Swamiji. It's just an Om. That's the way he would have wanted it. So I no longer wave incense at an image of Swamiji. I still say the mantras. I can't help it. But now I'm going to worship Swamiji the way that he wanted me to worship him. Once and for all, I'm going to commit to the true puja that Swamiji taught us, talking to you. Right? Whatever I can do for you is worship for Swamiji. I don't need to have his picture on my altar. I have his picture right there. There's Francis, there's Anna, there's Krameshwari, there's Patrick G. Who else do I need to worship but this? This is my Swamiji. Screw the photo. So anyway, but yeah, so yeah, Ruth, there's no picture of Swamiji on my altar because there's a picture of Swamiji over here. Okay. No, no, I mean that's great too. I think that's also awesome. That's the tradition. The tradition of the Ramakrishna mission is you have all three, and like Swamiji is really inspiring. And don't get me wrong, I've had wonderful experiences in the Pasadena house, sitting in front of the image of Swamiji. It's all awesome, right? But anyway, I like to say these things from time to time. Don't take me too seriously. Now, let's let's go into the Vedas. This is the basic framework from which all Tantra will develop. All Shaivism will develop from this. But this is the basic framework, and I think in our own life this can be implemented in this particular way by just like living Vedically. Now, let's come to the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna was born to a Vedic Orthodox Brahmin family. Maybe not that Orthodox in that they were farmers, so some of the Brahmins in this time turned to agriculture, and that can be criticized also because a Brahmin should be engaged only in religious service. But even then, even as farmers, they were Orthodox Brahmins to the T. They were very careful about food rules. They were very caste conscious. They did all their Vedic duties, and they were devotees through and through. And they spent most of their day like fasting and making malas and offering that mala to their family deity, and they were upkeeping the family shrines, all of that. Very holy Vedic family, never told a lie. They kept to the truth so sincerely that they were dispossessed of all their property. Sri Ramakrishna's father, Shudiram, was asked to bear false testimony for a land dispute. And when he refused to do so, the unscrupulous landlord divested them of their ancestral property and kicked them out. Fortunately, though, Satyameva Jayate, truth always triumphs. It's another Vedic aphorism. Fortunately, they were then given shelter at like a friend's house, family friend's house, like that. And so Sri Ramakrishna was born to this kind of family where the mother and father were ardent Brahmanas, followers of Vedic orthodoxy. Sri Ramakrishna himself was very orthodox. I mean, when you think about it, you're stunned by this thought, but he himself followed the Vedic rules to the T. For instance, when Rani Rashmani, a Shudra woman, started the temple called the Dakshineshwar temple, Ramakrishna did not want to go there. His elder brother Ramkumar was pretty edgy and unorthodox and willing to take certain risks. And it was Ramkumar, by the way, who was instrumental in the forming of this temple because Ramkumar wrote a very important scholarly decree, as Swami Vivekananda so beautifully called it, and that allowed for the temple to be constructed in the first place. And so naturally, Rani Rashmani, the founder of Dakshineshwar, wanted Ramkumar to be the head priest there because it was his scholarly decree that gave that place some shred of legitimacy. But Sri Ramakrishna was very against his brother going to be a priest at Dakshineshwar, and he himself didn't want to come. And he would say, like, our father would never have done this. Our father, Shudiram, a Brahmin through and through, would never have taken food at a Shudra's temple. This is in violation of all our caste codes and conduct, and this is a terrible thing. Sri Ramakrishna, he obeyed this kind of thing. The same person who would later wash the floor of a chandala, of a dalit, of an untouchable with his own hair. The same person who would transgress every possible code of conduct for a Brahmin, that same person was caste conscious and worried about eating food in a temple started by a Shudra woman. A Kaivarta Shudra woman. That's a very important point. Anyway, all of this comes down to this village custom where you put two leaves in a pot. One leaf says yes, one leaf says no. It's called Dharma Patra. And you ask a child to draw one of the two leaves out from the pot. If the answer is yes, that would be the solution to the problem. So Ramkumar put yes, go to Dakshineshwar, and Ramakrishna put no, don't go to Dakshineshwar, and they put it in the pot, and the child chose yes. So somewhat dramatically, all of this comes down to that, right? Like that's the claim in the Leela Prasanga. Like it's quite stunning to think that it all came down to one moment where a child pulled a leaf out of a pot, and the pot said yes. The leaf said yes, go to Dakshineshwar. So with great reluctance, Sri Ramakrishna followed Ramkumar, his elder brother, to Dakshineshwar with great, 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 great reluctance. And when he got there, he refused to eat the food. So Ramkumar said, okay, look, I know you can't eat cooked food here at this temple because of our caste rules, but there are some provisions in the store, and you yourself said that anything done on the bank of the Ganga is holy, given how holy the Ganga is. So why don't you take some provisions from the store and cook your own food? Swapaka, it's called, the austerity where you only ever eat food that you yourself have cooked. So why don't you take that and go and cook your own food in the bank of the Ganga and be done with it? And Sri Ramakrishna was like, fine. So that's what he did. He refused to eat the food of the temple, and he only ate food that he himself cooked by his own hand on the bank of the Ganga. How orthodox he was. And he was very avoidant of the authorities of the temple because Ramkumar was so well loved. He was excellent. He was an excellent pujari. He was a genius, and he was a spiritual prodigy. Like Ramkumar had like powers of prophecy, and he was a very spiritually magnanimous person. So naturally, they had great love for his younger brother also, Ramakrishna. So they kept trying to get Ramakrishna to do work at the temple, but because of his caste consciousness, Ramakrishna did not want to involve himself with temple affairs. Isn't that interesting? Um, and Ram Kumar kept trying to persuade him to get involved, and he kept relentlessly avoiding and avoiding and avoiding. He just kind of hovered around the temple and ate his food by the bank of the Ganga and stayed out of things, because he was so adherent to his rules, which is really interesting that it takes a lot of rule following before you can really get to the place where you can abandon all those rules. It's a bit like this. Let me give you a metaphor. Say you want to solo freely on the guitar. Until you sit down and learn your scales and learn the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it, you won't be able to play freely. See, if you want to be John Coltrane, you have to first master the rules in order to overcome them. If you've ever seen like Picasso's paintings or something, like those people who like paint like really crazy stuff that it looks like a child or an elephant could reproduce it, you have to first see what kind of painting they did before that. Masterful. Like perfect realism, like photograph almost. They were masters. Therefore, they could break all the rules. You see, there's a principle here that I think we could all remember, do well to remember, that a certain level of rule following and discipline in the beginning, only in the beginning, is good. So Sri Ramakrishna was like that, so fanatical about his caste and his Brahmin rules and whatnot. And again, all of this is like different for us, right? So he must have been around 19 at this time, 18 or 19. He was a very young man. He's 18 or 19. Yeah, you need to know the rules to be able to properly break them. So he was like 19, he was there at the temple. Now Ram Kumar very much wanted him to be involved. And then Ram Kumar died. And that's an interesting thing, because when Ram Kumar died, that's when he filled in the role as head priest of the Kali temple. Before that, he was just dressing the image with Hridoy, which was Rameshwar's son, I think. So it was his nephew. Hridoy was Ramakrishna's nephew, and with Hridoy, Ramakrishna would like dress this. He started doing little jobs here and there, and maybe doing a bit of the worship in the Radha Kanta temple next door. But he wouldn't worship Kali. He wouldn't do the main duty. But when Ram Kumar died, he did. Now, something very interesting happened during this period, and the chronology here is a bit fuzzy. But I'll just say it this way: he started learning puja from Ram Kumar. Like maybe because he just wanted to be closer to his brother, or like fulfill his responsibility to his brother, he started learning puja. Specifically, he started learning Kali Puja. And more importantly, he took a mantra diksha with the Kenaram Bhattacharya. So his diksha guru, part of the Purnananda line, Kenaram Bhattacharya, is Kenaram Bhattacharya, K. Bhattacharya, who gave him a Kali mantra. So he got a mantra from a guru in the traditional diksha format, and then he went and started doing started learning puja at first. And puja is very, very sophisticated and refined and difficult, but he learned it very quickly. He was a spiritual prodigy in that way. Then his brother died. And when Ram Kumar died, that's when Ramakrishna started to take up his role as the head priest. He was only 19 or so at the Kali temple, at the Kali Bari in Dakshineshwar. But unlike the other Brahmin priest of that day and age, for him, puja was an intimately personal practice. Like puja was the attempt to experience God's living reality in real time. It wasn't just a practice to please the goddess to fulfill a function at a temple in order that the temple might attract devotees. It was a sadhana, a personal quest to realize God. So now I'll take you into the story of Shaivism a little bit. Again, we'll just alternate between these two stories if you don't mind. I hope you're still with me. I know we've gone quite a long time into the lecture, but now I hope we're picking up a little bit, getting into the juicy stuff. So in Shaivism, what happens is, during the Vedic period, a group of Brahmins, most likely Brahmins, break off, as it were, and form their own cult. And it's hard to say what exactly we would call this, but it's the cult of the god Rudra. In the Vedas, there is this deity. His name is Rudra. At first, he's described as an outcast. There's Rudra there. And Rudra means the crying one, the howling one, the terrific one. So at first, the Vedas kind of reject Rudra, or have like a pretty they haven't DTR'd yet, they haven't defined the relationship. He still seems like a fringe deity, like an outsider deity in the Vedas. But there are swaths and swaths of sections in the Vedas devoted to this Rudra. And in the Krishna Yajurveda, for instance, the Shukla Yajurveda, Krishna Yajurveda, Rig Veda, you get the Triambaka mantra and the Rig Veda even. But in the Yajurveda, you have this Rudra Shutkam, the Shri Rudram. It opens with that. Everyone knows it. It's a very famous one. It opens with Om Ganana Antva Ganapatingung Havamahe Kaving Kavina Mupamashavastamang Notebihi Seda Sadhanam, that little bit. It opens with that, and that's where you get your Triambakam mantra. That's Hara Hara Hara. There's Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam. These are powerful mantras, and they're Vedic. You can feel them. Immediately when you chant these mantras, you feel that they're coming from a very ancient and eternal and universal place. So this Shri Rudram is often chanted. Yes, the Mahamrityunjaya mantra comes from there. And there you get many names for Lord Shiva. Sadashivaya, a lot of names. Tripurantakaya, Triambakaya, Mahamrityunjayaya, like different names for Lord Shiva. That's from that Yajurveda. Anyway, there are about 100 or so names of Lord Shiva in the Krishna Yajurveda. So those names, those 100 names of Shiva and the 100 or so names of Shiva in the Yajurveda is referred to in an agama, in a tantra called the Mrigendragama. The agama devoted to the lord of wild animals, Mriga Indra Agama. And there they make a direct reference to that Yajurveda mantra, which shows you that the tantras are actually rooted in the Vedas. And in the Vedas, the first experience of Shiva is had as Rudra, as this fierce storm god who is propitiated in the Sri Rudram and in various other places. So Shiva is there in the Vedas. But dare I say it, Shiva is there even before the Vedas. It's argued that prior to Vedic civilization, there was a tradition, the Mohenjo-Daro Harappan civilization, and there are also Dravidian civilizations that were perhaps all present in India way before even the 1900s, etc., BCE Vedic revival or something. Like, it's hard to say exactly that these were different traditions or when they might have emerged. Maybe they were both emerging at the same time, who knows? But there was definitely a very full and robust civilization that died out, maybe because of an environmental disaster. But others say, and I feel like I'm in this camp, that they never died out. They just went from being a Mohenjo-Daro Harappan civilization to being a Vedic civilization. So anyway, this is where it gets very fuzzy and scholars have different views here. But in Mohenjo-Daro, the Harappan civilization, we find evidence of Lord Shiva. We find seals of a person meditating, a person that resembles Lord Shiva with wild animals around him, who has something that looks like a crescent moon on his head, or it could be horns or something like that, and he has a very erect phallus. So we see a meditating guy with an erect phallus, and that comes from like 3800 BCE like that. So way before the Vedas, we find evidence of Lord Shiva. Also, in the archaeological finds in these dig sites, like in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, this tradition is, by the way, called the Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization, one of the first few civilizations in the world. And so here we find evidence of Lord Shiva, specifically the form known as the lingam. We find the yoni and the lingam, so the worship of Shiva and Shakti, is there even prior to the Vedic period. The architecture seems to support such an idea. And archaeologists have even found these kundas, these vessels that probably were Charanamrita kundas. To what extent that's true, we don't know. It's still very fuzzy. It's in the mists of early history, the dawn of human civilization. But the evidence looks stunningly like what today is a lingam and what today is a Charanamrita kunda. And of course, that one proto-Shiva cannot be ignored. The image is just too reminiscent or too foreshadowy to ignore. It really looks like Shiva and the worship of the lingam and the yoni, all of that. So the idea of Shiva and Shakti, that might have existed even prior to Vedic times. So some scholars like Devdutt Patanaik, they argue that like Shiva is a Dravidian god or a Mohenjo-Daro Harappan civilization god. And then when the Vedas were emerging in India, they were struggling with the insertion, or maybe even a forced insertion of Rudra into their pantheon. So Rudra, from that point of view, is already an outsider. He represents a different kind of India, maybe even. So it's almost like a reluctant admission of an earlier civilization, a more primordial, more protean civilization into the Vedic canon. But then that attitude changes. By the time you get to the Atharva Veda, remember the Vedas are also chronological. There's like the Rig Veda at the very beginning and the Atharva Veda at the very end. So what you get in the Atharva Veda seems to be a warming to Shiva, a warming up to Shiva. Like now, Shiva is no longer Rudra, he's Pāśupati. He's now the protector of cattle, which is so sacred to the Vedas. The cattle is like central to the Vedic sacrifice ceremony. Cows were perhaps sacrificed during the Vedas. I'm sorry to break it to you, but the evidence seems to be leaning in that way. So Swami Vivekananda used to joke. He was like, the glory days of India were when 5 Brahmins could polish off a cow between themselves. So I don't need to get into that. There's a lot of politics there. I myself would never eat beef, but maybe that's just one of those things that we just have to, but the evidence seems to lean in that direction, that they were sacrificing horses and calves, not just cows, but calves. But the cows are important because not only do you get milk from them and their excrements are really important, but also the meat. And they're also used in Vedic sacrifices, right? Like the cattle, horses and cows and whatnot. And now Shiva is seen in a kind of Yeah, if no cow, no milk. So milk and meat. That's what most people did anyway. But then, and there's a lot of very interesting uh, economical arguments here why, there's ritual context for all this. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion that we don't need to have right now. But the point I'm trying to make is how Rudra, this terrifying storm god, then becomes, in a sense, Pāśupati, who is the lord, Pati, of the Pashu. Pashu here means cattle, these wild animals that you can collect and take care of and that are essential to Vedic civilization. They were like for many groups a nomadic sort of pastoral civilization. So cows are very important, and Shiva is now very important because he's the protector of the cows. So all of this is there in the Vedas, but a group of people become fixated on Rudra. This might even be prior to Puranic India. The Puranas, of course, present now Shiva as a fully fledged cult of worship. But prior to that, even maybe in this early time, it's shrouded in the mist of history. There were groups of people, at least a group of people, who started focusing everything on Rudra. They became Rudra Margins, the followers of the way of Rudra. These are like the early Shaivas. And there are a few groups among these. Perhaps the most primordial of them can be called the Pāśupatas. There are a few. The Kalamukas, the Kapalikas, there are different names for them. The Shaivas, the Pāśupatas. But I think I'm just going to stick with the word Pāśupata. Pāśupata is an ancient form of Shaivism, and it's a form of Shaiva dualism, and it's basically the cult of Rudra. So I put it over here in the chat. This idea, the Pāśupatas presented this doctrine, which is fivefold in nature. We don't actually have any text from the Pāśupatas except a text called the Pāśupata Sutra attributed to Lakulīśa. But Lakulīśa's Pāśupata revival is different than the kind of Pāśupata Shaivism I'm talking about now. Although it calls itself Pāśupata, there are many key differences that we might explore next week maybe. For now, the Pāśupatas seem to have these 5 categories of reality. Karya, the world is an effect. The world appears. And Karana, there must therefore be a cause. Because there is a world, there must be a cause of the world. Yoga, and there must be some method to become one with that cause. Vidhi, there must be some rules and injunctions in order to be able to practice that yoga. And as a result, Dukkhanta, the end of all suffering. So moksha, according to the Pāśupata, is defined as the end of all suffering. And the means to moksha is defined as yoga and vidhi, which means, interestingly, meditation and ritual, or contemplation and ritual. I hope you can see the seeds of what will later turn into Shaivism. This is already Shaivism, but will later turn into the traditions that we tend to study. So Lakulīśa, who I'll talk about another time, he reformulated all of this. He would say there are only 3 main categories. They are Vidya, Kala, and Pashu. And these are 3 in 1. And that one is Rudra or Shiva. And so that Rudra, the 1, and then the 3, do you notice this how para, apara, like that? Or the basic trinity of Pashu, bound soul, Pati, the lord of the bound soul, and Pashas, the binding agent. So Shiva, me, and Shakti. Pashu, me, Pati, lord, and Pasha, that which both binds and frees. So all of that primordial Shaivism, that stuff is germinating in this Pāśupata cult, So of the Pāśupatas, there were groups that later become the Nyāyakas and groups that later become the Vaiśeshikas. So you might have heard of these types of philosophies, right? Indian philosophies are maybe 6-fold in nature. That's because in the Christian era, 700 AD, like that 900 AD, there were a few authors who I haven't really mentioned before. I haven't really had any occasion to mention them, but this might be a good one, who kind of formulated all the various schools of India into these particular schools. One of them is known as Haribhadra Suri. I think Haribhadra Suri might have been one of the early ones, and he composed a work which, if I'm not mistaken, is called Shad Darshana Samuchaya, which means an investigation into the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. Now, here was Haribhadra's theory. He looked around, he's like, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, there are innumerable schools of philosophy. But when you look closely, you see that all of them are I can't say the word, I'm just going to spell it. Soteriological, in the sense that they're all emanations of religion. All philosophies in India are rooted in the religions out of which they emerge, and all religions have a soteriology, a doctrine of what it means to be free and happy. The purpose of religion is to attain freedom and fullness and happiness. So these philosophies come from the religion and they support the religion. So they are soteriological in nature, but they differ only to the extent that they have different ideas about what that means. The differences in these philosophies can be traced to what they think the ultimate state is, and more importantly, what they think the categories of reality are. They differ in terms of their description of reality, and they differ in terms of their prescription of what to do, and they differ in terms of their description of final salvation. And if you look at things that way, then there are six primordial schools. There are really only six schools, and all the other schools can be collectivized under these six headings. And you know what's really interesting? It's not the list that you're familiar with. If you've studied Hinduism in any capacity, you probably would have learned that the Saddarshanas are as follows: Nyāya, Vaiśeshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Vedanta, or sorry, Purva Mīmāmsa and Vedanta, Uttara Mīmāmsa. So Purva Mīmāmsa, Uttara Mīmāmsa. So that's the thing. If you, Paro is pointing this out, if you've learned Hinduism, Jainism and Buddhism is not included in this list, but Haribhadra Suri included in his. It's so interesting. His six schools were, if I'm not mistaken, Bauddha Dharma, Buddhist Dharma, Jaina Dharma, so the Jains were included, the Nyayakas, the Sankyas, and Jaiminiya, and one more. Nyāya Vaiśeshika, Bauddha Dharma, Jaina Dharma. It's not yoga. That would come later. No, it's not. Charvaka wasn't included actually. Oh, I'm blanking on it right now. I'm missing something. What am I missing? It's not yoga. It's not Vedanta. He mentions Jaimini. So anyway, let's start with Jaimini. Jaimini is the founder of a school known as Purva Mīmāmsa. Purva Mīmāmsa is basically an emphasis on Vedic ritualism. They didn't reject the Upanishads, they de-emphasized the Upanishads. This will later be called Purva Mīmāmsa, and it's contrasted against Uttara Mīmāmsa. Uttara Mīmāmsa is what we call Vedanta. And Vedanta isn't just Shankara's Kevala Advaita. Vedanta isn't just non-duality. Vedanta is also all the dualistic and qualified non-dualistic schools, mostly by Vaishnava masters like Achintya Bheda school of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Chaitanya, and no, not quite that. That comes much later. That's a medieval movement. So this is way back. This is like in 700 AD, like that, way before Sikhism or anything like that. Sikhism is very modern, very new religion. But Jainism was included. Jainism, Buddhism was included. Sankhya, Nyāya, Vaiśeshika. Maybe it's Pāśupata. Well, I just had it. Anyway, it's okay. But the reason I point this out is because Haribhadra Suri then analyzes these schools. And what he says about Nyayas and what he says about Nyayakas and Vaisheshikas is very stunning. He describes them to the T as Pāśupatas, as Shaivas. He says they tend to wear their hair in jata. Some of them are married, some of them are unmarried. Of the two, the unmarried are given greater importance. So the ascetic tradition is valued over the household tradition. They smear themselves with ash 3 times in the morning after washing their hands. They abide by the laws of hospitality and they worship a Shiva lingam. And some of them have a Shiva lingam on their arm and they carry around the Shiva lingam, which, by the way, which would later be the main practice of the Veera Shaivas or the Lingayat Shaivas of the Basavana movement. But Basavana, interestingly enough, was reviving a movement that already existed back then, the tradition of wearing a Shiva lingam on your arm and covering yourself in ash. And they practice the Vedic mantras for Lord Shiva, which are 5 in number. They're the Ishana, from Sadyojata mantra all the way to Ishana mantra, including Tat Purushaya Vidmahe and Agorebhyo Tagorebhyo. So they were practicing these Vedic mantras and they were practicing Om Namah Shivaya. So that was their main mantra, Om Namah Shivaya, plus these 5 other mantras, which we'll learn together on another occasion. These are the essential Shaiva mantras, which are central to the whole tradition, from Pāśupata all the way up to Trika. From early Shaivism all the way up to Kaula Tantra, like that. So these 5 mantras, but they're Nyayakas and they're Vaisheshikas. So the argument that these people make is that Gautama, the founder of Nyāya, is a Shaiva. He was a worshipper of Shiva, and so too was Karnada. Karnada himself was a worshipper of Shiva, and both of them founded movements known as Nyāya and Vaiśeshika. Today, Nyāya and Vaiśeshika are kind of considered the same. They're not really the same. Nyāya is more about logic and Vaisheshika is more about metaphysics, but you can see their categories are roughly the same and their idea about liberation is very similar. Dukkanta. They believe in God and they believe that God, which is the karana, the cause, created the karya, the effect. But God, karana, and karya are distinct. Karana is distinct from the Karya, and they believe in yoga and in vidhi to attain, more importantly, dukkanta, which is similar to the Pāśupatas. So the Pāśupatas were perhaps the prototype for the Nyayikas and the Vaisheshikas. Gautama, the founder of Nyaya, and Kanada, the founder of Vaisheshika, both of them were probably Shaivas, as Haribhadra Suri argues in like 700 AD, like that, which is really interesting, isn't it? And then another person, Raja Shekhara, who would also compile in the 900 ADs something similar called also again the Sadarshana Samuchaya, and then also a Guna Suri, who would later in a later period also compiles a text. All of them corroborate this idea that the Nyayas and the Vaisheshikas are Shaivas. They're early Pāśupatas, if you will. So Kapila Muni of Sankhyan fame and Nyayas and Vaisheshikas, they might all actually come from this world of worship to Rudra. That's kind of an interesting idea. We don't really think about that very much. And if you look over here, historically speaking, these these historians, they call Nyaya the Akshapada Darshana. This is the Sha as in Shodashi. So Akshapada Darshana, which was revealed by a Shaiva incarnation known as Akshapada. That's why it's called Akshapada Darshana. So Gautama was a founder of this school, inspired by Akshapada, a form of Shiva. And the Vaisheshika was founded by Alukya Darshana. This word means owl. So the owl school, because they believe that Lord Shiva came in the form of an owl and taught them Vaisheshika. So Nyaya and Vaisheshika are closely allied to the Pāśupata. So these are like the early traditions of Shaivism. Now, what can we learn from Nyaya? I think this is very important. Let me make a point now with regards to our own life and our own study. Nyaya is all about logic. In other words, it's all about thinking clearly. And the practice of Nyaya is learning to think in a clear and grounded way. A lot of people come to spiritual life very scattered. They don't know what they mean by God, and they don't know what they mean by liberation. They don't really know what constitutes the path or what's worth striving for. And without that basic sense of like intellectual clarity, it's very difficult to actually practice spiritual life. You can't get to a place if you don't know where you're going. And so Buddha would point this out. He would say, you need samyak drishti, right view. And the Nyayas were all about cultivating that view. Their philosophy aside, their categories aside, and their soteriology aside, very basically, they were an emphasis on logical thinking, on like clear thinking. And I think this is important. A lot of Shaivism is founded in Nyaya. A grounding in Nyaya might be helpful. I'm not saying you need to study Nyaya. It's very dense, and there's a reason why I haven't given many classes on it. I'll scare you all away. It's a very, very difficult philosophy. But what we can take from this idea is this. We should be clear in our thinking. We should define our terms. Nyaya is very careful to define all of its terms, and we should carefully check our links in our thinking. Does this argument, this idea, necessarily logically imply the other? And if not, be careful. An error in our thinking could be like an error in our direction. We might be just 1 degree off, and we might end up in a very different place. If a plane were to be 1 degree off from its course, that could make the difference between Tijuana and Timbuktu. You know, like just one, I don't actually quote me on that. I don't know what exactly, but I mean it poetically. Like 1 degree difference could be the big difference actually. So clarity of thought is what we got from the Nyayas. And the Vaisheshikas, of course, they're in a sense an extension of the Nyayas. Their categories are more metaphysical in nature. So these people could all have been early Pāśupatas. But very basically, the Pāśupatas were dualist. They believed in Rudra as God. And they argued that this God was distinct from the world in which we appear. So this God creates the world, but really what he does is he molds the world into existence with something that exists independently of him. Like that. So these were the categories of the Pāśupatas, the early Pāśupatas. But one thing that was interesting about their practice, and you see that especially with Lakulavada or Lakulīśa, who reformed the Pāśupata movement with his text known as the Pāśupata of Lakulīśa, Pāśupata Sutra of Lakulīśa, which was commented upon by Kaundinya. So we sometimes just call it the Kaundinya Pāśupata Sutra. One thing you find about this tradition, which by the way is in another lecture I'll talk about more. It's kind of distinct actually from this Pāśupata tradition. It's a reform movement, if you will, that takes this dualistic tradition in a more qualified non-dualistic way. And these are so much discussed here, so I'm going to save it for another time. But one thing that's interesting about this, as you can see over here, is that the aspirant, this is from the Nishvasha Tattva Samhita, may eat and drink anything. No action is forbidden for him, for he is immersed in the contemplation of Rudra, knowing that no other deity will save him. I'm using Alexis Sanderson's translation here. So now, it's very important. The Lakula Vada, the Lakulīśas, went to the cremation ground and they went straight to the cremation ground. The Pāśupatas ended up in the cremation ground. In terms of practice, they were very fond of the cremation ground because Rudra in the Vedas and in the Puranas especially is described as the god of destruction, and he tends to live where destruction is most manifest, in the cremation ground. He's the Hara, the destroyer. And so cremation grounds are a very spiritually rewarding place for a follower Rudra because they associate those places with Rudra. So the Pāśupatas end up in the cremation ground at the end of their journey. But the Lakulīśas went there right away. And in the cremation ground, they're hanging out with the Nyāyas and the Nyāyikas and the Vaiśeshikas and the Saṅkhyas, and a kind of philosophy was brewing. Now these people have started finally to transcend the Vedic rules of the previous period. And they started doing interesting things too, not only covering themselves in ash, but they'd also start eating out of skull bowls and wearing like mortuary symbology, like bone necklaces, and they would carry a skull-top staff and a trident and a club and something like that, and they started to look very ghastly. In other words, they started to resemble the god that they worshipped. And it's very interesting because in the Puranas, Shiva performs a penance for having killed Brahma. So what ends up happening is Brahma, he lusts after his own daughter Usha, and Shiva, in order to prevent this tremendous transgression from occurring, appears in the form of Bhairava and chops Brahma's head off. But now he's just killed a Brahmin. The most horrible thing you could do in the Vedic time is kill a Brahmin. It's called Brahma Hatya. So to atone for his sin, as it were, Lord Shiva covers himself with ash, wanders about naked, eats out of a skull bowl, and lives in the cremation ground. In a sense, these Pāśupatas, under the Lakulīśa reform, did that. Why? I argue it was because they killed the Brahmin within. They were orthodox Brahmins before, but they knew that it was holding them back. It had brought them some of the way. The Vedas definitely brought them a long way, but to really go further, to really get to God, to go beyond legalistic religion, to really get to the heart of things, to get to devotion, they had to leave all these rules behind. When you get intimacy with God, formality flies out the window. Rules no longer apply when you have an intimate relationship with somebody. In the beginning, we're all very formal. You know, it's like your first date, for instance. You have to fulfill certain conditions. You need to buy the roses. You have to go to a particular restaurant. But then, by the time you get to your 8th date, you're like, hey, take out the trash. You know, you get a kind of informality with your beloved. Similarly, once you really, really love God, you forget all about these rules. And so these early Raudrins, if you will, they went into the cremation ground, and the Lakulīśa reform meant that they no longer cared what they ate. Some of them just transgressed Vedic rules. Being in the cremation ground itself was a transgression of Vedic purity principles. They had killed the Brahmana within. Okay, now back to Sri Ramakrishna's life. Sri Ramakrishna, and I'm going to be a little anachronistic here, he started becoming interested in this kind of practice. So he would go to cremation grounds and he would sit there all night meditating in the cremation ground, doing his japa, and probably with the mantra that he received from Kenaram Bhattacharya. Or he would just sit there and contemplate and meditate. Like he did that even when he was a child. In fact, the first thing that Sri Ramakrishna did when he was born was he crawled into an oven, not an oven, sorry, like a pit in the ground that you could light a fire in, which is covered with ash, and he rolled around like a little baby in the ash. And when they found him, they found little baby Ramakrishna covered in ash, sitting there, you know, like that. So he already had that Shiva bhava. So he would go to the cremation ground regularly and spend time there, God knows, doing God knows what. And one day, Rameshwara, his brother, came to get him, calling out to him because they had lost him. All night he was there, young boy. They were like, where'd he go? Where'd he go? Ramakrishna, Gadai, Gadai, Gadai. That was his name back then. Gadai, Gadai. And he said, brother, I'm here, but don't come in. There are ghosts here. And if you come in, they might harm you. See, Ramakrishna doesn't mind. He's one with the ghost. He's in the cremation ground. But, you know, he warned his brother not to come in. So he was very fond of cremation grounds. Then also, he started doing some interesting things. Like, he had this weird desire one day to clean the floor of a sweeper's bathroom. And back then, the bathroom was just a floor that you shat on. It's not like a Western style commode with a flush or anything. It's just shit on a floor. And Ramakrishna used his hair to clean that shit up. Literally. Which is interesting, because in the Pāśupata Sutra, which Lakulīśa reformed, you find an emphasis on these kinds of practices, where you smear yourself in excrement, yours or someone else's. Again, I'm not prescribing these practices, I'm just describing them. And then you would go into the marketplace. A lot of people make that mistake, you know. I describe something and they're like, oh, he told me to relax. I'm describing, not prescribing. Anyway, they would smear themselves in excrement and go into the marketplace and mutter obscenities. Why? Perhaps to get rid of any notion of caste consciousness, to scrub it out of them with the hair on the floor. Sri Ramakrishna was not just scrubbing shit off the floor, he was scrubbing his sense of superiority, his pride of caste. He was overcoming his purity principles. with this very radical discipline. So the Pāśupatas were interested in doing things like this, like radical things like this. And every time they got kicked or spat at or cussed out in the marketplace, they were happy because it meant people were absorbing their bad karmas, and it meant they were being purified and effaced of their ego, which is necessary for devotion. So what's the teaching here? Again, you don't need to go to this extreme. But the teaching is that anytime anybody like says mean things about you or disrespects you in any way, you think, wonderful, they've absorbed my karmas. I wish them well. I'm grateful to them actually for scrubbing the ego out of me. I don't need to react. If I react, it's almost as if they did me a disservice. But the very opposite is true. By scolding me, by being mean to me, by depriving me of opportunities, I should protect my boundaries. I should bow from a distance and leave that place, but I should never be resentful of them. I should never in my mind think, how dare they do that? I should say, thank God those people have come to absorb karmas from me. In other words, thank God they have come to efface me of my idea of self-importance. This is essential for bhakti, for real surrender to the Lord. So these Pāśupatas were doing things like this, and you find Sri Ramakrishna himself was engaged in Pāśupata type practices. But more importantly, the Lakulīśa Pāśupata doctrine said that there were these 8 pashas, these 8 obstacles that keep you from spiritual life. And one of them was shame. A feeling of shame prevents you from practicing spirituality. Now, a lot of us suffer social anxiety, to go back to that point if you don't mind, because we feel shameful. We're like ashamed of ourselves. Now, you can't practice spirituality really if you're ashamed, if you're full of guilt like that. That guilt, that shame saps a lot of energy from you. So these people were shameless. They would wander about naked, and they would wander about covered in shit and stuff, and they wouldn't mind whatever reactions they evoked from the crowd because they weren't ashamed. And if they were, these kind of shock therapy treatments helped them overcome that feeling of shame. Also, the feeling of disgust. They helped themselves to all sorts of practices to get over that feeling of disgust, aversion, and of course, most of all, pride of caste or pride of family birth. So these are all the pashas. They're called the Ashta Pashas, the 8 fetters. And Sri Ramakrishna constantly refers to them. Throughout the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we find that he brings up this doctrine of the 8 pashas a lot. Shame, hatred, fear, disgust, pride of caste, etc. And the Pāśupatas, their whole doctrine was premised upon effacing these from yourself through such shock therapy treatments as this. Do you see? You can kind of see the coherence, right, in the whole of Shaivism just from studying like Lakulīśa's Pāśupata system. Anyway, so I'm going to wrap up now because there's a lot more to cover, but I want to just finish with the Shaiva Siddhānta and call it a night, and we'll have a bit of Q&A and maybe pick up this topic later. You guys, by the way, I'm about to give a retreat in the Vedanta Society at Atlanta, which is very exciting because I've got 3 full days to just talk all day. It's fun because we get to cover so much together. So if you guys get to come, do come. It's free and open to the public. But what's interesting is these lectures are a bit longer because I'm getting into that mode now. The mode of covering bigger themes, which take maybe longer to explain. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm just now coming to the end, I think. So the last thing I want to say is that Sri Ramakrishna, he was doing these things, right? He was engaged in this kind of like nighttime practice in the cremation ground. This same person who only a few months ago was afraid to eat the food in a Shudra's temple, is now sitting under an Amalaki tree in the middle of the night, naked, having cast off his sacred Brahmin thread. Once Hridoy went looking for him, and he found him in this state, naked under a tree, doing japa, without his Brahmin thread. And Hridoy is like, why have you taken out your thread? I mean, as a Brahmin, this is the mark of your caste and your authority. And he took it off and hung it on a tree somewhere. Why did you do this? And Sri Ramakrishna said, because to worship God, one must cast off all such notions as caste. Right? Notice, this master of caste consciousness, who had abided up to that point by every possible rule of like a Brahmin orthodox code of conduct, is now casting off the sacred thread and meditating naked and cleaning the floor of an outcast's bathroom with his own jata, with his own hair. Could this have come if he was not rooted in the Vedas? Would this act have any meaning if he didn't find, first of all in his life, solace in the rules of the Vedas? Maybe. Again, I'm not going to make a case either way. You can decide. But it's telling that he was first a Brahmana, first following Vedic rules before he started transgressing them. You see? So the ecstasy of bhakti, I'm going to argue, must be founded at first in a regimented, routine-oriented, stable, grounded life. Then all that stuff can go out the window, but by that point, you've already got the psychological and physical stability for it. You know, otherwise, this can easily become psychosis or perversion or something degenerate if you just skip to it. That's, I think, it's a sequencing error, you know. People who skip to these practices. I know someone who went, unfortunately, went a bit um, crazy to use the word. Although that's not a very like, is that okay? Okay, good. But and he was trying to tell me he was like doing all these practices, and I'm like, I don't think you should be doing them. And he's like, no, 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 I licked the shit. I'm like, bro, chill. Like, I don't think you understand. I much prefer that you speak to your father. Like, you talking to your father is licking the shit. Like, get out of the toilet. Even your dog is not allowed to go in there. You're going in there and pick up the phone and call your father. Like, I was trying to tell him these kinds of things, but it was clear that he had committed a sequencing error. He was trying to do these more radical practices without being grounded in like in Sri Ramakrishna's case in the Vedas. Anyway, so Vedic lifestyle, and then come these transgressive like Raudra Marga, Pāśupata type practices, these almost eccentric shock therapy practices to get rid of the Ashta Pashas, the 8 fetters. Okay, then Sri Ramakrishna, at this time, he's doing all of this, but he's also importantly during the day like studying puja with Ram Kumar. So I want to close with this idea, the Shaiva Siddhānta. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot next time because Sadhyo Jyoti and I put a few names here, as you'll see in the Shaiva Siddhānta. This is also a reform movement. So this kind of stuff is going on, like all this Pāśupata stuff and the Nyāyas and the Vaiseshikas and these people, by the way, you can call them Atimargins or Mahavratins or stuff like that. So all of this stuff is going on. Then comes the Mantra Marga. Now, the Mantra Marga, as opposed to the Ati Marga, is a householder oriented tradition. The Shaiva Siddhanta is oriented towards householders, and its main text might be the Raurava Agama, or the Swayambhuva Agama, or the Svachanda Tantra, which is very popular in a place like Kashmir. Now, there's someone called Sadhyo Jyoti, and he maybe might be the most important name in Shaiva Siddhanta. Another word for him is Ketapala. I put 2 T's here because I couldn't put the dot under the T with my keyboard, but it's Ketapala or Ketakananda. That's another name for Sadhyo Jyoti. So he composed texts like the Moksha Karika, the Bhoga Karika, right? Moksha, Bhoga. Moksha Karika, Bhoga Karika, Tattva Sangraha, Tattva Traya Nirnaya. So the explanation of the 3 tattvas, or an explanation of reality, or verses on enjoyment, verses on liberation, stuff like that. He composed a lot of texts actually, and his main text, or I should say one of his texts, was commented upon by Aghora Shiva, a very important person who we'll be talking about in the next lecture. And then Brihaspati, who came after, he talks about a lot of things that Abhinavagupta accepts. And then there's also Shankara Nandana and his text Pragya Lankara. But we can't also forget Ramakanta and Sri Kanta and a variety of other authors and masters who I'm going to introduce you to next week. But this whole Shaiva Siddhanta, the only thing I want to say about it now, and of course we got a lot of stuff to talk about, like the Bhairava Agamas and all of that stuff, which we tend to talk about here most of the time anyway, so I'm focusing on some of these earlier stuff right now. But like these guys and these women and these people like who formulated the Shaiva Siddhanta, this is important because the Shaiva Siddhanta is like using a lot of the material from the tradition that came before, the Pāśupatins and the Kapalikas and whatnot, and they're reframing it for householders, and more importantly, they're putting it into a puja modality. So puja becomes the main practice of the Shaiva Siddhanta, and diksha, initiation, along with daily rituals, becomes like the mainstay of this tradition. Now that's what Sri Ramakrishna was learning. The puja that he was learning to Kali is rooted in the agamas, the traditions of Shaiva Siddhanta. So it's interesting because this Pāśupata, like Lakulīśa stuff is going on in Sri Ramakrishna's life as he's doing all these very like cremation ground type sadhanas. All this is before Bhairavi Brahmani, mind you. Just to make those of you who know his life, this is all before Bhairavi Brahmani. Once Bhairavi Brahmani comes, tellingly, you'll notice by her name, you get the Bhairava Agama stuff. So this is the second phase in Sri Ramakrishna's life. But in the first phase, he's still here, in like dualism. He's still practicing a dualistic form of religion in which he's meditating on Kali in this like Pāśupata way, and in which he's doing Shaiva Siddhanta type rituals. Now, he learned these rituals from Ram Kumar, and when Ram Kumar died, when he passed away, he started engaging himself in the daily worship of Kali in the temple. But unlike the other pujaris, like I was saying earlier, he gave himself heart and soul to the practice of puja. So other people, their puja would be finished very quickly. It's an elaborate puja. So that's really saying something when I say that he spent hours and hours and hours doing it. Because it already was quite a few hours. It was an elaborate puja. But he would just be lost in it. When it came time for the meditation, he would sit there for like 2 hours. Sometimes he would fan mother with this fan, he would fan mother for like hours. And when it came time to offering food, he would try to like push the food into the mouth of the image. And sometimes he would eat the food himself. He would say, "Oh, mother, you want me? Okay, I'll eat it first, and then I'll eat." Like, okay, that came a little bit later. But importantly, at this time, puja became this profound expression of his longing to find God. Once he started doing puja, he started asking himself, "Is this real? Like, I'm a Brahmin. I was brought up this way. I like learned how to do these worships. But now that I'm doing this worship, I'm seized with this sudden desire to know whether or not there's anything to it. Is there really a presence in this image which I'm feeding every day?" And he became obsessed with this question. Does God really exist? And does she really come in the form of the image? And does she really partake of the food that I'm offering her? All these questions naturally must arise. And they arose with such force in his mind that he did puja so intensely to try to answer them. It's a remarkable kind of paradox. Some people will only do puja once they're convinced that God is there. But Sri Ramakrishna did puja to try to figure out whether or not God was there. That's why his puja was so intense. Because it was no longer just a temple official officiating as a member of his as a member of his public as part of his public communal offering. He was now a sadhaka, using the theater of puja to articulate his yearning for God. So he would like hold his finger under the nose and try to see if the mother was breathing, and he would cry out to her and say, "Mother, you revealed yourself to Ramprasad. Why don't you reveal yourself to me?" Ramprasad was a great singer that he very much looked up to and sang songs from. Now, all of this expresses something, a scientific quest. He wants to know for himself whether God is real or not. The reason why he has reason to believe God is real because other people have seen him. Other people have experienced Kali. So there's corroboration. The fact that Kali appears to people in the image is a corroborated fact. And so because it's a corroborated fact, Sri Ramakrishna wants to test it out for himself, like any good scientist, you see. So this is an important movement. Sri Ramakrishna approaches religion as science. If something has been observed and measured and experienced by somebody anywhere in the world, then I too, if I perform the experiment, should be able to observe tangibly and measurably that same thing. What? Only Jesus can have this experience? Only Prophet Muhammad can have this experience? Only Moses can have this experience? That's manifestly unscientific. But because of that, people deny the experience. No, the experience is not to be denied. The elitism of the experience is to be denied. That experience which Moses had, which Jesus had, which Buddha had, you can also have. And you must have. Then alone is it called religion. So Sri Ramakrishna used puja, the Shaiva Siddhānta puja, to articulate his longing for God. This is still within the concept of dualism. There is God, and here I am in this world, and I am longing to experience God, and so I use the puja. So Shaiva Siddhānta, which we're going to describe in depth, hopefully next week, if not next week, the week after that, probably next week. Given how long these lectures are, probably next week. So we're going to discuss all of this more. But for now, I just want to leave you with this thought. The main contribution of Shaiva Siddhānta to all of this is puja, but not just puja as Vedic ritualism, not just like as an attempt to attain some kind of enjoyment here or hereafter, not just as some duty that you have to fulfill to your animals and to your community and to your parents and to your rishis and to your gods, not just some lifeless, legalistic, rule following kind of thing. This puja is the kind of ritual that gives expression to your heart's innermost desire to see God and feel God and know God and be one with God. That's the kind of puja that Sri Ramakrishna was doing. So I want to present puja now as the practice par excellence, because puja draws a lot from Vedic sensibility. There are certain purity rules that we follow in puja that are rooted in the Vedas. For instance, don't offer things with your left hand, unless you're doing the Kaula rituals, in which you are specifically told to offer things with your left hand. You see, that won't make sense until you first ground yourself in the practice of offering things with your right hand. In other words, when you give something to God, you put one hand here and you offer, or you offer with both hands. Like there's like a way to give and there's a way to receive. Before you do puja, you must take a bath and wear proper clothes. Before you offer food to God, you must make sure no one has tasted the food. You must cook that food yourself. And then after you cook that food, you can't taste the food to make sure it's good or not. Otherwise it's uchishta, it's defiled. And then you offer it to God. You yourself must avoid eating uchishta food. You must perhaps not eat out. Stuff like that. Again, you have to be sensible with these things. A lot of rule following can tend to destabilize you as much as it stabilizes you, so you have to be sensible. But these rules are important, and they're there in the puja itself. Shaiva Siddhānta, right hand path puja, is your doorway to like Kaula. That's the case I'm making. Because a lot of us come to Kaula, we come to Tantra, we want the hardcore stuff. We just want Trika and Advaita, but we don't want Shiva. We don't want the grounding. But Shiva's first revelation, as it were, is this Shaiva Siddhānta. Lord Shiva teaches us, as Sri Kanta, he teaches us these ritualistic forms of approaching him and that are very rule heavy and rule oriented and purity centered. They can be very Brahminical, actually. So Shaiva Siddhānta takes the best of what the Pāśupatas had to offer and then Vedicizes it, Brahmanizes it. It becomes a Brahminical, public-facing householder movement. And I think that's valuable. Usually when I speak of these things, it almost sounds like I'm speaking pejoratively. Oh, it's a Brahmin kind of thing. It's very rule following. No, no, no. I by no means imply that it's somehow lower. In fact, it might be foundational. So I'll leave you with that idea. Let us all learn puja. And most importantly, let us abide to the best of our ability to the rules of puja, that one day we might transcend them in a fit of ecstasy, grounded in sensibility. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu Shri Shri Parameshwara Arpanam Astu. Jai Devadi Deva Mahadeva Ki Jai. Namo Parvati Pataye. Har Har Mahadev. Jai Ma. And stay tuned for episode 2. We'll continue with Sri Ramakrishna's life and we'll continue with the trajectory of Shaivism. And then it'll probably take us 3 or 4 or 5 lectures to do all of this, but I think there'll be a good payoff to it. I hope. Okay. Jai Ma. Oh, that's it. Okay, so how was Shiva Ratri?